Hello and welcome to My Baseball History. I'm your host, Dan Wallach. My Baseball History is a long-form interview podcast where each episode I'll talk to someone new who has some sort of association to the game of baseball. No matter who I talk to, we'll talk about how they fell in love with baseball, how their career started, and how they got to be where they are today. On today's episode, I spoke with the official team historian of the Cleveland Guardians, Jeremy Feador. Jeremy was born and raised in Ohio and earned his undergraduate degree in history and political science at Baldwin-Wallace University in Berea, which is about 15 miles southwest of Cleveland. He completed his master's degree in public history at Wright State University in Dayton, and while pursuing that degree, he worked as a graduate assistant in the Wright State University Library's Special Collections and Archives. After graduating, Jeremy worked as an archivist for Baldwin-Wallace, for the Cleveland Browns, and for the Hale Farm and Village before being hired by the then Indians. Jeremy's primary responsibilities as the Guardian's official historian include maintaining the displays around the ballpark, including the Bob Feller exhibit, filling requests for information, and digitizing photographs. He also assists with social media for the team and with promotional information. Jeremy has provided Cleveland Guardians historical presentations to fans at libraries, museums, and other venues as another way to preserve the history of the team and its great players. As if all of that wasn't enough, Jeremy also hosts Cleveland's Team, a baseball history podcast, which chronicles stories about the history of the franchise. While each of Jeremy's podcast episodes takes a deep dive on a particular story or player, or is an interview with a former member of the organization, our interview for this episode of My Baseball History was an attempt to boil down the history of professional baseball in Cleveland into one conversation. We start in the 1860s with the first professional team in the city, and run through the end of the 1948 season when Cleveland won its last World Series. So naturally, in this episode, we cover lots of ground. Jeremy tells us about the many different names the professional baseball teams in Cleveland have called themselves over the years, and the inspiration behind those names. We find out who the best players were in Cleveland's rich baseball history, discussing them chronologically as the team's names repeatedly changed. We learn about Cleveland's magical 1920 season, and what the team had to overcome before playing in one of the most momentous World Series in history. And we hear about the Cleveland Baseball Hall of Fame, which the team started in 1951 by inducting an inaugural class of 10 great former players, including Cy Young, Tris Speaker, Napoleon Lajoie, and Shoeless Joe Jackson. With all of that information and much, much more coming at you, it may be helpful to follow along with the episode's liner notes on our podcast website. You'll still be able to enjoy the interview without the extra help, but sometimes when I'm listening to things like this, I like to really go in depth. So I've provided some photos and links to give you a better understanding of the things Jeremy and I are discussing. Those liner notes can be found on the My Baseball History website, which is online at www.shoelesspodcast.com. If you want to follow along, head to the website where you'll see the Jeremy Feador episode listed first on the main page under latest episodes. Click on that and you'll be ready to follow along. There's an embedded media player right on the page, so you don't need to have multiple windows open while you listen or fumble around with multiple devices. If you want to catch up on any of our previous episodes, you can click on the tabs at the top of the website to go back through past episodes from any of the 3 seasons to date and see a full list of everything we have to offer so far. Everything in the liner notes goes in chronological order of how we talked about them in the interview, so you should easily be able to keep your place as you listen. After the interview, we'll do a recap of what you just heard, adding some extra insight and hopefully answering any questions that may have come up as you listened. And for 2 lucky listeners to today's episode, we'll be giving away autographed copies of books Jeremy and I bring up during our conversation. So stick around until the end of the episode to hear how you can enter to win. But now, here's my interview with the official team historian of the Cleveland Guardians, Jeremy Feador. I feel like almost all the people who are super into baseball history get into it very, very young. How old were you when you really started becoming interested in it?
I am from Cleveland. I was born, technically, I guess, in Cleveland and grew up on the west side in North Olmsted. I was born in 86, so I was a child of the 90s. And for me, growing up, we had a new ballpark. The team was fantastic, Tommy, Bell, Baerga, Vizquel. So it's hard not to be a baseball fan growing up, and there were no Browns. So I think I'm part of this generation, and I know there's people in my generation that are interested in the Browns. I just am kind of lukewarm. It's been an interesting 20-some-odd years since they've been back, but, from a historical standpoint, that team was severed off, and they brought back the new team. So I played football. I just wasn't as interested in football. For me, it was baseball. Initially it was those 90s teams, and then like with most kids, you hit high school and college, you kind of fall out of some interest and get into some other ones. So baseball kind of ebbed and flowed for me, but I ended up going to a little college called Baldwin-Wallace in Berea, which is where the Browns have their facility, and I've always been into history, and it was there that I got into public history, which then parlayed a big cemetery project we did into a graduate scholarship at Wright State. And once I got back into the museum archive stuff and got a little bit older, I started getting back into baseball again. And I've always loved the history. My dad had old baseball cards, and fortunately he sold quite a few of them. I've always had an appreciation for the past, and I was actually working for the Browns for a while in their alumni department, and I thought, well, I love Cleveland, I love history, and I love baseball. I'm like, why don't I just take a shot with the then Indians, now Guardians, and it worked out. So happy to have shot my shot, so to speak.
Yeah, that's awesome. You mentioned you went to Baldwin-Wallace. While you were there, you were a cemetery researcher. What does that mean, and what is the coolest thing you discovered while you were researching cemeteries?
So I was being weird for a while and thought I wanted to be a biology major, which was the biggest mistake of my life. My brain works in the history field, so I ended up, it was this perfect storm of everything. And there was an email over one summer, and a professor, the head of the history department, said, hey, the local Legion Post is looking for students to research headstones and figure out who the veterans are in the cemetery so they can mark them, because the previous guy had passed away without a written record. And very soon thereafter, I was kind of like the driving student on all this. I was able to figure out who these guys were. We were able to mark that. And then that project, we had a ground-penetrating radar come in and find unmarked burials. I spent a whole summer going through old newspapers and researching the stories of these people. Wow. We were able to fix some headstones. So we were able to find headstones for a veteran. We were able to get him a new headstone, and a great-great-grandkids of some guy that was gored by a bull and died in his field, end up getting him a headstone and figuring out, it was kind of like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, I like to mention. Like, when that scene where he's just making the mashed potatoes into the mountain. Like, for me, I had this lot map and like a lot list, and I was able to like figure out like what the key was, because it wasn't just your traditional like cemetery-looking map. It was kind of, there's an older section and a few other different sections. So we were able to dispel urban legends and various other things. And I think it was just a great start learning what public history was and local history, because, even with baseball, yes, it's on a national level, but there's so much local stuff. There's tentacles that go out that you're not going to find in a baseball reference or something like that. Those are the cold hard numbers, but the fleshing out and the local connection is important in developing anyone's story. So I've been able to parlay a lot of that skill or background into what I do here and help tell the story. And for that, it was, local residents who had houses that were still standing and who had connections to Baldwin University at the time and German Wallace College. And, that cemetery had issues with vandalism. But when you bring out the fact that, hey, this isn't just some old blighted cemetery, it's spooky and blah, 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 it's actually got connection to where we are today. I think that stops people from viewing it in a negative light and look at it more positively.
Yeah, that's one of the things I always tell all my volunteers at the museum is when they're training to eventually give tours, I can tell the first day they walk in, because like I wouldn't say I'm the Joe Jackson expert, but like I know quite a bit about the guy at this point, So when I give them their first tour, I can just see the wheels are turning, like how am I going to remember all this stuff? And I assure them, like, you do not have to learn statistics. You do not have to memorize what his on-base percentage was in 1912, because A, nobody cares about that. And B, the people who do either already know it or they know exactly where to go to look for it. So they're not coming here to learn that stuff. They want to hear the stories. And I think a lot of people don't really understand that that's what makes a place like that interesting.
Right, and I think that I've told people that too. It's like, yes, I'm the official, Guardians historian, but if someone said, what did Tris Speaker hit in 1922? Like, I don't know. Like, there's baseball reference for that. Like, that's trivia. It's part of his life.
Those are the records. That's not the history.
Right.
So just because like you decided that you wanted to become the team historian of a baseball team, that doesn't always necessarily mean that that's how life works out. When I was 6 years old, I decided that I was going to be the shooting guard for the Chicago Bulls. But how did it work out that you actually did become the historian? You said you shot your shot, but then what happened from there?
So I ended up writing a letter to Bobby D, who's our longtime PR guy, and he ended up sharing it with Curtis, who's now my boss, who's the head of our communications department. And I just sent my resume and cover letter, and I figure the worst that's going to happen is they're going to throw it away and life will continue on. But, I've looked and you see how many teams have someone in a position like this, and Cleveland didn't. And for me, I was like, well, let's see what happens. And they ended up calling me in, and actually didn't work out that year. They're like, well, we're in our next budgeting cycle, keep in contact. And it just seemed like the stars aligned. Like later that year, there was a New York Times story about team historians. I shared that with Curtis and just kind of kept in contact, not from like a pestering sort of way, but like, hey, this is interesting. And I worked on a proposal like, hey, we should be doing this, this, and this. And the next year, Curtis said, hey, we can bring you on as an intern and see what happens. And luckily for me, I have a very supportive wife who's had me on her health insurance and all that stuff. So I was lucky enough to be able to take some risks, I think, that would be difficult otherwise. And that same year, the Bob Feller Museum in Van Meter was closing. So Bobby D and I kind of flew out there and packed up a U-Haul, and he ended up flipping me the keys. And I've never driven a U-Haul further than maybe 10 miles. And here I am driving over the Mississippi River in December. And it's like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I got these priceless artifacts.
Right, with Bob Feller's irreplaceable items in the back.
Yeah, it was something else. And actually, the New York Times ran a story about it. And there's kind of a running gag with some people I know that I was listed as another Indians employee. So I wanted a retraction, but I never got around to writing to the New York Times. But after that, we did our Feller display at the Terrace Club, and there's support from the top, from Paul all the way down, in terms of preserving our history. And I think baseball more than any other sport. I mean, baseball's Hall of Fame. It's the one people care about the most. There's so much talk about it versus, the Football Hall of Fame's cool. It's in our backyard, so I'll gas that up. It's a great place. And then there's basketball, but baseball, man, that's where the conversations are. You probably more than anyone are aware of that. So baseball and history are just so interconnected. And as much as fans are fans of Shane Bieber and Jose Ramirez and Fran Reyes, you're a fan of this team too because of Bob Feller, because of Lajoie, Shoeless Joe, Sam McDowell, Rocky Colavito. I mean, baseball is just so interconnected with its past, and that's why you have movies like Field of Dreams too that resonate on such a level. With a public history background, I'm able to do a little more PR communication stuff. So I'm half history, half communications. So you'll see me on TV, on local news, and I help with our social media. So if you're yelling and whatnot at us, I'm one of the people you're cursing at. And
so be nice, everybody.
Yeah, it's a nice avenue to get our history out through social media, something that we didn't have 15 years before.
Yeah.
So, it's always this evolution of how we're able to communicate with fans, and social media has been a great way to get history out.
Well, I think that's kind of what the point of this episode is going to be. I kind of want to use this interview as a way to go through all of the different names that the Cleveland franchise has had or other baseball teams in Cleveland history. And as we go through the timeline, we can talk about who the best players were on those teams and talk about the history. So where does the name Guardians come from, and how do you think the locals have kind of taken to it so far? The locals. Because that's not to cut you off before you even start answering, but I think when the name was announced, a lot of the people nationally kind of were like, Guardians. But a team name isn't supposed to impress somebody in San Francisco. Like, you're the Cleveland team, so it's supposed to be for the Cleveland people that name means something. So to people from Cleveland, does the name Guardians mean something?
Yeah, I think when you boil it down to like team names, when you extract them from wherever they're from, there's no Tigers in Detroit. There's no Cubs that are Bears in Chicago. But, for us, there's a bridge, and I think it's behind me. Yeah, it's behind me. I can see it. Over there, they're the Guardians of Transportation. And, I think if you separate the rock and roll aspect of Cleveland, you got to look for other stuff. And, people have always kind of been attracted to those statues just because, you're coming into the city. It's one of the first things you see if you're coming from Ohio City. And people walk over that bridge to the games and stuff. And there's just these imposing statues of these dudes or whatever holding the various transportations. And they were carved in the 30s by local guys. And, it's just that gritty, resourceful beauty carved out of rock. And, there's a lot to Cleveland, I guess, that resonates with that. And I know we like to, tell people one of the big things was just like that. We're very protective of Cleveland. We're not Chicago. We're not New York. We get dumped on a bit by the same old jokes. The river's on fire or this and that. And so it's kind of like that little brother mentality at times, I guess, when you stick up for yourself. Because Cleveland's a great place. I mean, I'm obviously biased because I'm from here, but you have the big city feel with less traffic, with the cost of living that's fantastic. You have 3 sports teams, a world-class art museum, world-class orchestra, world-class healthcare, the second biggest theater district in the country or something of that nature. So you get all this stuff, and I think when people aren't aware of Cleveland and haven't been here, you just kind of run with the what you've heard, and a lot of times it's just this worn out negativity of wherever, and I think it kind of makes you a little more sensitive to like our siblings, whether it's like a Buffalo or a Milwaukee. Like I'm never gonna dump on one of those cities because they're just like us, and there's no point in doing that either, because you close yourself off to certain things, you're going to miss out on a lot. And I think Cleveland has a lot to offer, and with that, we're very protective and proud of where we're from. And again, if you look at those statues, you kind of get that sense of being proud and guarding what we hold dear.
Yeah, and I think as somebody who is from Chicago and has a lot of friends who moved to Chicago from Cleveland, they have kind of always used the Guardians as like shorthand. Like if you have that logo on your t-shirt or something, it doesn't need to say established in Cleveland, Ohio. Like if somebody's from here and they see that logo, they know. And I think that's kind of the ideal thing for a mascot or a logo of a team name to be. It's like, we all know what it references. Yeah, I don't care if you know. This isn't for you. It's for me. It's my team.
Right.
Yeah.
And like Golden State, they wear the Golden Gate Bridge on their uniform. Like, these statues are uniquely Cleveland. And for us, it was just kind of one of those things you see every day, and you don't necessarily maybe think about it that way. But now people are now more aware of that. And, I think you're going to see hopefully more of that maybe when national media comes here to film games. Yes, they always show the Rock Hall and the other landmarks, but I have to imagine they'll be showing those statues a bit more. Yeah.
So the team name had remained the same for over 100 years. And like we talked about earlier, the Cleveland baseball teams have gone by many different names throughout their history. So let's talk about some of them. Professional baseball in Cleveland officially began on June 2nd, 1869, when the Cleveland Forest Cities played the Cincinnati Red Stockings.
So that is like the common start point. Forest Cities actually originated in 65.
Okay.
No, it's fine. But
no.
They were paying
You're the
guys.
historian, not me.
They were
I'm just
paying
reading.
guys in 69. But yeah, in 65 they originated and played. I think they played like one or two games that first year and kind of getting post Civil War America. But then by 1866, 1867, 68, you have Deacon White ended up on the team, and he's just got in the Hall of Fame in 2013, I believe. So in 69, we were paying some guys. I think Deacon was being paid, but it was still kind of a mix. We weren't quite the Reds where everyone was getting paid, and it was pretty out there. But there were guys on our team being paid, and they had that first game against the Reds that year. But the Forest Cities kind of come into being, and that's really the first organized attempt at baseball in Cleveland. There were previous mentions of ball playing, whether or not it was baseball, don't necessarily know, but with them, that was the first organized go at it.
And so they played in the National Association. Where does the name Forest Cities come from?
That's the thing. Like there's another team too, the Rockford Forest Cities, which I think that was outside of Chicago. Or
Is Cleveland called the Forest City?
that's one of our nicknames.
Okay.
Again, I'm not sure what the exact pinpoint of that is, other than I think even that Tocqueville guy, when he came to Cleveland, mentioned how many trees and how green it was, and obviously we'd like to get to more of a green space, I think, than we are now. But I think it was just something to do with the way the landscape was. And if you look at etchings and engravings from the 1860s and that's 1870s, you do see more of that park-like atmosphere. So there was a Forest City cricket team. So it had been floating around for a while before the baseball team picked it up.
So in 1879, the National League expanded to Cleveland, and that team was called the Blues. The Blues disbanded in 1884, but another team called the Blues joined the American Association 3 years later in 1887. I've read differing accounts that they were actually called the Blues or that they were called the Blue Birds and it was shortened to Blues. What's the deal there?
With a lot of those like early nicknames too, I think there's a certain fluidity to them. If you go into the Plain Dealer archives, and again, we're at the mercy of what's at your fingertips unless you have time to really sit and comb through microfilm for decades. But the Plain Dealer's archive is digitized, and there really are no mentions per se of them being called the Blues, at least in the Plain Dealer. A lot of times just the Cleveland baseball team. I think we want absolutes, and I think that's when you run into problems, is that so much of baseball history, any history, is that gray area between yes and no.
Right.
You're at the mercy of who created the records, what records still survive. And if you were to go back in time and sit at the ballpark and listen to people talk, they might have been calling them the Blues or the Bluebirds or whatever. But when you don't see it in primary source material, it's kind of difficult. And I think you run into issues too with stuff. That 69 Forest City thing is just one of those examples too of someone puts that down. I think it's in Franklin Lewis's book, and I think maybe in Wikipedia or a few other sources. they cite that, and then there's just no return back to actually look at it critically and say, wait a second, where does this come from? There's no citation from it, and it's just regurgitated and taken as fact. And that, I think, in a broader picture, is what makes my job. One fun aspect of it is just rehashing those taken for granted facts, so to speak, and saying, well, wait a second, like, let's double check. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I'm also not saying I 100% believe it at this point, because again, early history, sometimes, that Franklin Lewis book I'm talking about, the Cleveland Indians, came out in 1949, I believe. There's a lot of stuff in there that, looking back, it's like, this is not, this probably isn't, like, how would you have had this information? Where'd you get this from? And
well, that's one of the things I wanted to ask you, because I know that you do a lot of your research through the Cleveland Plain Dealers archives, and they've been digitized, but does that ever get you into trouble where you assume that, like, all right, well, it's in the newspaper, it must be true, but it's only the one source, you don't know where he's getting his information from? Like, I run into that stuff all the time as a Joe Jackson researcher, where a lot of these stories have been the ones that have pervaded over all these years, where how he got his nickname. Everyone's theory is that, okay, well, he hit a triple one day and it was a game in Anderson, South Carolina. And we had one of our docents at the museum, his name is Mike Miller. When he started, he decided, all right, well, I don't know enough about Joe Jackson to give tours, so I'm going to go do my own research. And he triangulated the date that game must have happened. And he found out that, A, it wasn't in Anderson, it was against Anderson, but it was in Greenville. And B, it wasn't a triple, it was a home run. And he found the paper that came out the next day that referenced it as being the longest home run ever hit in that stadium. So, like, things like that where, if you just read the stories that have been told all these years, that doesn't necessarily make it true. So does the fact that you rely so heavily on your research from the Cleveland Plain Dealer ever get you into trouble? And do you wish that you had other references to be able to kind of zero in on where these true stories came from?
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the beauty of where we're at now. Is just there's so much stuff that's digitized, which, again, you run into trouble in that respect, especially if you're doing family history, for example, too. If you just rely on what's digitized, you're missing out on this. It's the tip of the iceberg. Now you have the away team newspapers, too, at your fingertips. So tonight I could be watching Charlie Brown Thanksgiving while also, Googling and going through some stuff. But yeah, you think about newspapers, too, in that era. Cleveland had several, and they were fiercely competitive.
Yeah.
Not to, like, flash forward, but I think one of the most fascinating things is, we say in 1903 we were the Cleveland Naps. Well, that was a Cleveland press contest. They ran that. So why would the Plain Dealer want to buddy up with the press, their rivals? Mm-hmm. So for a couple of years after that, they still call them the Blues. So you have these
out of spite.
Yeah. It's like, well, this was an R thing. Again, because names are very fluid. It's odd to me that the press isn't digitized because, again, you're missing out on and I know, it's not odd because it's expensive to do stuff like that, to get the OCR, to get wherever you have to find someone to host it. And I've always wanted to start a GoFundMe page to raise the money. Maybe I can. I don't know. Work with Cleveland State. I think they have that stuff. But you do miss a percentage of the whole story. And not to say that newspapers are the only sources that you need, but there's again,
it was the main source back then,
right?
And that's the one thing that has lasted all these years.
And they're the ones that covered stuff that normally would have fallen through the cracks. But then again, you look at who was writing the newspapers and who control. Like, there's a lot of reading between the lines with that stuff as well. But fortunately for baseball now, I think you see this in the Negro League stuff that's come out with Baseball Reference now including that in their stats. And whether it was I mentioned Larry Tye's book about Satchel Paige, there's just so much missing because the Plain Dealer wasn't covering all the Cleveland Buckeyes games. Right. So you don't have the complete picture of who Satchel Paige was, or who half these other guys were, because again, the dominant source of the time just wasn't covering it. So there's that gray area, and we want so badly to have things in nice boxes. But if you love the thrill of the chase, gosh, baseball research is where it's at, man. There's just so many rocks to tip over and see what's underneath.
On the flip side, how lucky are you that Cleveland had so many major newspapers and guys like Frank W. Smith, photographer, and Louis Van Oyen, like all these guys who were documenting what was going on in Cleveland that we can now look at over 100 years later and be like, oh yeah, that's what the uniforms looked like in 1911, or that's what the stadium looked like in 1917. Like, not every city has that benefit.
Yeah, and that goes back to my point earlier about just Cleveland being like that right-sized porridge, I guess. We're not too big, not too small. And to some extent, not to be like glasses half empty, but it is kind of painful because you see these great pictures in the Plain Dealer's digital archive, and it's a scan from the microfilm, so the picture looks grainy and bad. So you know that there's an original picture somewhere.
Yes.
Where did it go?
Yes.
Like it's lost, man. Like there's all kinds of things you come across. The four cities were in Niagara Falls when they were traveling, and it said that they got a photograph by the falls, and they weren't in their uniforms, so maybe someone has a picture of 10 guys with their regular clothes on outside the falls,
and they don't even know it.
Right. And so it's again kind of a treasure hunt. But I have a picture at my desk of the 1901. I think it's the only team photograph of the 1901 club, and half the guys have uniforms that say like Philadelphia or other random teams, but where that actual photo is, if you saw it, you've never guessed, hey, this is Cleveland.
Right.
So there's these painful moments, I guess, like, man, this is somewhere. This would be fantastic to go to the antique store and
right.
Then the other problem too, I've gotten this too, is just people like, hey, I have this photograph of this team. There's a C on it, so it's got to be Cleveland, or it's got to be. And it's like, if you realize the extent of amateur baseball and how big that was, especially in the early teens, there's just so many teams, and it's the needle in a haystack to find any information on that stuff.
Yeah. So let's get back to Cleveland baseball. So in 1889, the Blues changed their name and changed leagues. They jumped to the National League and became known as the Cleveland Spiders. Where did that name come from?
The Spiders name, actually, I think it was in the Sporting News. That's pretty well documented in terms of guys were kind of long and tall. They look gangly like spiders. So that was kind of one of the names that was tossed out there. But again, it goes back to that fluidity of names. It's like, hey, let's call them this, or we're going to start calling them that. But that one, you see it in the documents that it sticks around quite a bit.
Yeah, and so the best player, pretty much undeniably, of the Cleveland Spiders was Cy Young. He pitched from 1890 to 1898 for the team, and then again came back to Cleveland from 1909 to 1911 and played for the Naps, and we'll get to that team later on. But Cy Young holds nearly all the career counting statistics for records for pitchers, including most wins all time with 511, most losses, most games started, most complete games. He had 749 complete games. Like, that's insane. Most innings pitched, most batters faced, a handful of others. He passed away in 1955, and the next year they started calling the award given to the best pitcher in baseball at the end of every season the Cy Young Award. We all know the statistics, but I don't think too many people really know what kind of pitcher he was, and we certainly don't really know what type of person he was. So give me some good Cy Young tidbits.
So I know that there's a misconception with the nickname. I know John Thorne has pointed it out, and for the life of me, it slips. But that's not a reference to Cyclone. It's a reference to something else. But
I was at the Cy Young Museum yesterday, and what he said was, as a young boy, Cy Young was doing some pitching practice with his buddy in front of a barn. His control wasn't that great, so he kept hitting the barn. And at the end of the day, the guy who owned the barn came out and said that the barn looked like it was hit by a cyclone.
Oh, and that's the beauty of some of this stuff. It's just there's so many different tentacles, and you can't verify half of the stuff, so you just kind of take into consideration. With Cy Young, my wife's from that area. They have that big Cy Young festival. And my buddy Scott Longer, if you're familiar with, he's a great baseball historian in the area. Just recently wrote a kid's book on Cy. And I think it was John Thorne, too, that said he was looking to write a biography on Cy Young and came away with the fact that this was kind of just a boring guy. I mean, just, he did his baseball, went hunting. And what I like about him, though, is I think one of the reasons he said he retired was he was getting so big that he couldn't bend over to field ground balls. So he kind of saw the writing on the wall there. But he was like one of those ambassador guys that you'd always see at the ballpark. He kind of retired back home in Tuscarawas County, but he would come up a lot. And even now it's an hour and a half drive. So traveling from there to the ballpark in the 30s, 40s, 50s is probably a big to-do. But he was always at the ballpark. Some great pictures of him and Feller. So if you love that 3 degrees of separation or whatever, I mean, Feller seems to be this interesting catalyst. Were guys he knew, and if I could go back in time and talk to Bob, what was Cy Young? Because there's still people that I think remember Cy Young that were super young. Even when he came in, there'd be stories of when the Red Sox came in to Cleveland, and Tuscarawas County people would come up and have a Cy Young day, would be excited to see him. I mean, they loved him. And, if he wasn't pitching that day, it mentioned, oh, Cy's going to borrow a car and go down to, back home. And it's like, geez, you think of 1910, the country roads. I mean, that's a big risk of this guy, maybe not getting back in time for his start. But you'd love to have some sort of doctor, I think, too, to look at these guys from a current perspective. Like, how was he able to do that without blowing his arm out like Smokey Joe Wood to an extent where, that guy clearly tore a rotator cuff or something, but Cy just never slowed down until he just couldn't do it anymore. Sort of like a Bartolo Colon, I guess.
when baseball first started, it wasn't the goal of the pitcher to strike people out. They were feeding the ball to the batter. So it wasn't thrown with incredible speed. And then I think as the game started changing, guys didn't really know how to throw really hard. And it's as we've progressed, I think we have probably progressed past the point of our human limits, where arms aren't meant to do what a major league pitcher's arm does. And I don't think that's how Cy Young or old Hoss Radburn, I don't think that's how those guys were throwing the baseball.
That goes back, too, to having context of when you look at, stuff like this. I mean, will there be very many 300-win pitchers ever again? Probably not, There are going to be guys that have 39, 40 complete games this season? Definitely not, But yeah, you were a pitcher. You were going to go out there and you were going to finish the game. And, if we talk about Kovaleski later, his franchise record of a 19-inning pitch game will never be topped because that was what was expected. And like you said, it was small ball guys were slapping the ball around, bunting, and it wasn't Cy wasn't throwing 103 miles an hour and burning out by the sixth inning. So I'm not an exercise physiologist or whatever, but you do get curious. Think of these farm boy strengths, the Feller stories, the Cy Young. It's like there's just that natural strength some of these guys had, and their workout regimes were a bit different. But I would love to be able to go back in time and look at Cy Young, and he was around for so many important parts of our history. He opened up League Park in 1891 against the Reds. So it's always, a neat thing that if you go to League Park, you can stand on the same mound as Cy Young. There's not very many places. I guess you can go to Fenway and do it. Well, he probably don't let you on the mound at Fenway. But, Cy, and then I think he was at the opening of Municipal Stadium. He was at the 20 World Series as a fan. And that's the stuff, again, we talked about you don't see in Baseball Reference. You don't see in other things. Just this guy that was around and part of the fabric of Cleveland baseball that now it'll be 100 years and 30 years that he's been gone, they're more myth than human.
Yeah. So in 1890, Cleveland had a team in the short-lived Players League that was called the Cleveland Infants. Do we know anything about that team?
That's where I think being a Cleveland baseball historian is fun, because I've never dug into them too much, and I got to be careful not to bite off more than I can chew, because it's I want to dive into them and pull up more of this stuff and that, because there's all these random, one-offs. But now just mentioning it, I kind of want to pull my computer open and dig into that.
No, I'm the same way. In Greenville, they had what was called the Textile League, and there was all these different cotton mills that pretty much each mill had its own baseball team. And eventually, I would love to become an expert on the Textile League, but I'm kind of busy doing my job to be able to research every single thing that comes across my desk that is kind of interesting.
It's difficult. You find a name and you start digging into who that person was. You're in census records.
Right.
And, some people, that sounds absolutely dreadful. I think my wife would be kind of like, what are you doing? But for me, it's like, oh my gosh, this guy was here and there. And it's for people that just love it, it's a rabbit hole, and it's dangerous to an extent.
Yes. So League Park was built in 1891 as a wooden structure, and that was the home of the Cleveland Spiders. In its first iteration, what kind of ballpark was League Park?
Yeah, it was like any of those other ballparks of the era. It kind of stuck into a neighborhood. There's the story with the owners who built it on a location where they could get their trolley cars.
That was the Robesons, right?
Yeah. And, there were a few other ballparks. The four cities played, the association grounds, I think they called it. They had a fence, they had a grandstand, and a few other ballparks. And again, in my eyes are bigger than my stomach department, there's, a big traveling, walking baseball tour in Cleveland that needs to be done with old ballparks and plaques and this and that. But there's so few pictures that exist of it, and that's what also is part of the quest. Is I know people have stuff in photo albums. When I worked at Baldwin Wallace as the archivist there was a photo album that had pictures of a game from 1909 because the students were there, and it was kind of a big deal to go to a game at the time, and cameras were relatively more mass marketed then, so it was a big deal to have one of those. So I have to imagine in people's attics there's photos of League Park, and there's a Library of Congress photo that's the ticketing window. There's a gentleman on Twitter, Brian Powers is his name. He did a reconstruction of the newer League Park, and I remember asking him, hey, is there enough of the old blueprints to reconstruct that? And there really isn't, which is unfortunate because it was a lot smaller, but it had that built around goofy structures around it, and it's the 5 or 6 pictures you can come across, and it's a joy to see, I think, because again, it's just that evolution of ballpark building, and for Cleveland, it started off with that. But again, those things were matchboxes waiting to go up too.
Yeah, well, that's why they started building stadiums out of steel and concrete, because wood burns. In 1897, the Cleveland Spiders became unofficially but almost exclusively known as the Indians. They were also referred to as Thibault's tribe.
Yeah.
They were also kind of known as the Warriors for a minute. But the story that most people think, or the kind of prevailing thought, is that since Louis Sockalexis was a Native American and was a superstar player for the Spiders in 1897, that's why they started kind of using that name. A, is that accurate? And B, like, what else do we know about Louis Sockalexis?
So if you're a member of Sabre, you have access to a bunch of online resources. I think Sporting News is one of them. And, there are documented cases, and you see that right away in the Sporting News is when Sockalexis does come. Sporting News starts referring to them as the Indians. And so you do see that in the historical record. And, Sockalexis was this player to behold. I mean, the story's now trying to navigate that channel between, the real person and the legend. But, there's all kinds of stories of how far he could throw a baseball, how hard he could hit it. He was an exceptional athlete, and unfortunately he just had some demons that he was unable to get past, and he was just this meteorite, I guess, that burned out before his time. And I think it was 3 seasons, and the total number of games I think was even under 100.
Yeah.
So it's one of those tragic baseball tales of all the potential in the world, but you'll never know what could have been. Mm-hmm. Came in at an interesting time in Cleveland's baseball history for sure.
There are people who think that he was the first Native American player in baseball history, but it's possible that that's not even the case either. Some historians believe that the first player in Major League history of Native American descent was actually James Toy, playing for also a Cleveland baseball team, the 1887 Blues of the American Association. While the degree of his Native American heritage has kind of been called into question, he did play 10 years before Sockalexis, so regardless of the timeline, Sockalexis' impact on Cleveland's baseball was undeniable. In 1899, Spiders owners Frank and Stanley Robeson purchased a second team, the bankrupt St. Louis Perfectos of the National League, who later became the Cardinals, and then they promptly sent all of the Spiders' top talent to that club, including future Hall of Famers Cy Young, Jesse Burkett, shortstop Bobby Wallace. The Spiders players who were left were referred to as the Misfits. They finished the 1899 season 20 and 134. And that's a record which remains to this day as the single worst season in Major League history. The Spiders were subsequently one of the 4 teams contracted by the National League that year. Was all of this turmoil specific to Cleveland, or was this kind of just how baseball was back then? I mean, like, we're talking about half a dozen professional teams over the course of 30 years in this city. Was that common? Yeah,
I think it was just, to some extent, the Wild West of figuring things out. And that Cleveland team, too, that wasn't an accident. People knew they were going to be bad. You look at the newspaper accounts for the start of that season, and I think one of them from, the Plain Dealer said, the fix is in. This is going to be bad. This team is not going to do well. They've sent everyone away. So it wasn't a surprise to anyone that this team finished 20 and 100, whatever it was. And at some point, teams just stopped wanting to come to Cleveland because no one was showing up. Mm-hmm. And they have these 20, 30-game road trips. So the thought that this team was going to compete is one of those things I like to get out there, that, hey, they were behind the 8 ball from the get-go, and this was just waiting to happen. And, I think that St. Louis team didn't really do much either. So it was kind of a failed experiment in both ends. But, I think it showed the flaw in some loopholes. And I always found odd was that there was no ill will kind of harbored against the Robeson family. I mean, when Frank died, or Stanley, the obituary was still pretty gushing about them. They still lived in the area. Mm-hmm. They had, a nice house. But it was just one of those weird experiments that blew up and now is a part of baseball trivia, the worst record. But when you open it up to the context, it was a something that was set up to fail.
But it was after that Major League Baseball created the rule that you could only own one team, specifically so you couldn't do what they did, where you trade all your best players or assets to one franchise and let the other one kind of flail, because it didn't work out well.
No, it did not work out well at all.
Meanwhile, there was also a team in Michigan called the Grand Rapids Rustlers. They were founded in 1894 and they played in the Western League. In 1900, that team moved to Cleveland and was called the Cleveland Lakeshores. Around that same time, Ban Johnson changed the name of his minor league from the Western League to the American League. And in 1900, the American League was still technically considered a minor league. But in 1901, the American League broke with the national agreement and declared itself a competing major league. The Cleveland franchise was among its 8 charter members. They played that first season as the Cleveland Bluebirds, sometimes shortened to the Cleveland Blues. Next season in 1902, the players tried to rename themselves to the Broncos, spelled for some reason Bronchos, but it never really caught on. Where did that name come from?
Yeah, I don't know where the Broncos came. You just kind of see it in the papers, and that might have been a Cleveland Press thing. I think the Plain Dealer had still referred to them as Bluebirds in 1902. So it's just whose story you decide to take with it. And I'm pretty sure Broncos was a Cleveland Press idea, but both those teams were really trying to find their footing and in the league. And like I said, I can't imagine trying to start up a baseball league now.
Yeah.
And again, going back to the Wild West of it all, you see it in there.
All right, but let's not gloss over the formation of the American League, particularly as it pertains to Cleveland. Tell me about Charles Summers and what he meant not only to Cleveland, but to Major League Baseball as we know it.
When you start going back into the papers, you see Summers is pretty much attached to Ban Johnson. He was in his hip pocket just in terms of trying to get this league off the ground, and he's attending these meetings and helping out Ban with the formation of the American League. And he's in his early 30s. He's already a millionaire. He kind of comes from some wealth, and he's just kind of this young, rich guy that loves baseball, and he's trying to help get this league off the ground. And at some point he's got money in with the Red Sox. I think he's helped out with Chicago and maybe Washington.
Yeah, I think he loaned Charles Comiskey the money to build Comiskey Park.
Yeah. So, and it's weird that, and maybe that's something I need to lobby for, is he's not actually in our Distinguished Hall of Fame, which I think he definitely belongs in it. He's kind of this forgotten individual because everyone knows Ban Johnson. Well, I'll say everyone knows Ban Johnson, but if you're into baseball history, you know the name Ban Johnson, but do you know Charlie Summers? He kind of rides this interesting wave, and not to jump too far ahead of ourselves, but that period from 1901 to 1915, it's almost like a prologue to what transpires, I think, in that roller coaster that leads to 1920.
So in 1902, that's when Napoleon Lajoie became Cleveland's first big signing. From 1901 to 1904, he had the highest batting average in the league. In 1901, he batted .426 and led the American League in nearly every offensive category, winning the Triple Crown. He became not only their second baseman, but eventually also their manager. He was one of baseball's first superstars, so Cleveland just up and named the whole team after him. His name was Napoleon. They called him Nap for short, and until 1911, Cleveland's baseball team was officially called the Cleveland Naps.
You need the Charlie Summers story to get to where you're going. And with him, he's able to bring in Nap Lajoie. I mean, that kind of helps Cleveland get its feet in the American League and kind of like bring in a LeBron to the Cavs. You have this superstar that gets fans excited to come to the ballpark and adds a legitimacy more than, say, a guy like Candy LaChance or some of those other guys that were on those 1901, 1902 teams that, weren't Nap Lajoie caliber players, but I think if you're starting a team and that's kind of floundering about, you need someone that's going to anchor the team. And with Summers and then them trying to circumnavigate the rules that they could get Nap in Cleveland, because there's this whole to-do about him leaving his team in Philadelphia, and the chaos that ensued and got to a point where he literally wouldn't play when they went to Philadelphia. And if they went through Pennsylvania, he would take a train around it or something of that nature.
He wasn't legally allowed to be there, right?
Yeah. He had jumped his... the contracts, again, in the context, the contracts aren't like they are now, and the guys were bound to the teams at the owner's whims. So for Nap, and I think the story with his stuff is tied to another Clevelander. I think it's Delahanty. Nap thought he was getting paid just as much as Delahanty was getting paid, and it was more than Nap, and he was upset and said, "Hey, you guys have really screwed me over." And one thing led to another, and next thing you know, he's in Cleveland. There's court orders, and they skirt it by just literally not going to Pennsylvania. Right. So again, Wild West baseball.
Before the 1910 Major League Baseball season, Hugh Chalmers of the Chalmers Automobile Company announced a promotion in which a Chalmers Model 30 automobile would be given to the batting champion of the American League and the National League. The car was worth $1,500, so it was pretty highly sought after, and the American League title was going to come down between Ty Cobb and Napoleon Lajoie. Cobb had a .385 average and sat the last 2 games of the year to protect his lead, which was percentage points over Lajoie. On the last day of the year, Cleveland had a doubleheader against the St. Louis Browns. What happened during those 2 games?
So I'm going to plug my buddy Rick Hune wrote a book called The Chalmers Race. He's out of Columbus. Yeah. Fantastic book. Pick it up if you want like an extremely detailed account of all that. But what kind of came down to is, and it seems oddly enough that most of our wacky history moments end up with the St. Louis Browns. They just seem to be kind of everywhere, and they were such a horrid team. But nevertheless, it was a doubleheader, and I guess the reasoning is that a lot of guys didn't like Cobb. They wanted to see Lajoie win. He was a little more agreeable of a person. They told the third baseman, the manager for the Browns, told the third baseman for the Browns to play further back on the line. And Knapp ended up laying down, it was like eight bunts.
Yeah.
And, I think there was an error charged in one of them. And, they were trying to get with the scorer to change something. And more or less, it turned into a chaotic what happens now. And I think Ban Johnson said, well, Cobb wins because this was fishy, and ended up the manager got banned, and I think the third baseman got tossed too, and one of the assistant coaches. But to some extent, infielders did play deep on Lajoie. I mean, they said when he hit the ball, it was pretty hard. So now, once he started laying down bunch, you might, okay, maybe he's not trying to do anything, but then again, you don't want to get your teeth knocked in either. But then I think the most fascinating part is it was the 70s or 80s, someone was doing the research, and Cobb was actually credited with an extra hit or two. One of his games was counted twice.
Right, so he got an extra 2 for 3 in that season, which never happened.
So technically, the 8 hits.
But that mess up not only affected his batting average that season, but his career hit total, which is incorrect.
And that's where, again, Bowie Kuhn or whatever said, well, we're just going to keep it as it is. It's been so long. There's no right answer, I guess, to some extent. I don't know. It's such a hard thing to figure out because there could be arguments made for both ways. But the whole story is just funny to an extent of, of course, baseball records, they're not like today. I mean, everything is just so to a T. And there was just a story recently that came out that we might have had the first no-hitter in American League history because they were looking at newspaper accounts and it actually wasn't a hit or was an error or something like that, but the account that the home paper had was different from the way
Interesting, yeah.
So records can get a little fuzzy.
A couple of prominent players from the early years. Elmer Flick, 1902 to 1910 for Cleveland. He was really the right fielder before Joe Jackson got to Cleveland. He was a speed demon. From 1904 to 1907, he had 4 straight years with at least a 300 batting average, at least 15 triples, and at least 35 steals in each of those seasons. He had 10 straight seasons with 20 or more steals, and 7 of those he had 30 or more. What should people know about the 1905 batting champion and Hall of Famer Elmer Flick?
So Flick's one of those guys that kind of gets lost playing an era with guys like Lajoie and Cobb, and there's bigger names, and Flick kind of gets lost in the shuffle. And what I like about him, a local guy, I think Bedford, they have a statue to him out there. So you're in this era where you have a lot more locally born players, but with him, I think he's one of those guys that gets a little bitter too when the Hall of Fame isn't knocking on his door. And I think he's one of those guys that said, if I get in after I die, I don't want to be in, kind of thing.
Interesting.
But it's tough, I think, to you can't retire a number for Flick because he never had a number, and trying to get him out there, there's not a lot of stuff to have about. I mean, you can go and look at the records, and I could probably do more research on Elmer, but just that weird era where the team wasn't super great, they weren't super awful, they were just kind of a team, and he gets in later on. I think it's a Veterans Committee thing, and it's just in that period where guys, I think it's easy for them to get lost.
Yeah. Addie Joss was also with the Cleveland Broncos and Naps from 1902 to 1910. He is baseball's all-time leader in WHIP with a .968 career mark and a second all-time in career ERA with a 1.887 mark, trailing only Ed Walsh, who had 1.816. Joss completed 234 of the 260 games he started in his career and finished with 160 wins in a little more than 8 full seasons. He threw a 74-pitch perfect game against Ed Walsh of the White Sox on October 2nd, 1908 at League Park in the final days of the 1908 pennant race, and added another no-hitter to his resume on April 20th, 1910 when he beat the White Sox again. Tell us more about why Addie Joss was so loved and respected by other major leaguers, and then what happened to him in 1911.
I think it was not until Tim Lincecum no-hit the same team twice that a player had done that. I always find that kind of fascinating too. But Joss was kind of like a jack of all trades. He wrote for newspapers. I think he had a patent on a scoreboard, and I think they tried to use it at League Park. But he was just a good guy. I think they called him the human hairpin. He was very thin and had a kind of a wacky delivery. And our TV broadcaster, Matt Underwood, he did a documentary on Addie Joss. But he ended up contracting tuberculosis and died during the height of his career. I think he was 9 years into his career. And, just there was an overwhelming sadness across baseball. And this kind of rolled into what some call the first All-Star game. It was to raise money for Addie's family. and it was at League Park. There's a great panoramic. You got the Cleveland players on one side, and you have the All-Stars, and I'd have to pull up a list. I know Ty Cobb came, and the story is he either lost his jersey or didn't arrive in time, and they have him in a Cleveland uniform, so it's always quirky to see. I think Smokey Joe Wood was there. Quite a few of the who's who.
Absolutely.
Like Walter Johnson was there.
Tris Speaker, obviously. Yeah, Joe Jackson, Ty Cobb. Yeah, it was, like you said, the who's who of baseball, and tons of those names ended up in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, so, there's two games you could be a fly on the wall. One is that All-Star game. And there's actually a few pictures that came up at auction not too long ago from that it's just cool to see because, again, there's so little that survives. But then that 1908 perfect game, I mean, Ed Walsh was equally, I think he struck out like 15 guys or something of that nature, and there was just a random run that came across. But that was in the heat of a pennant race that Cleveland missed out by half a game to Detroit. But, I mean, it makes the hair on your neck stand up to be able to think about being at that game. And, one of the best pitched games, I think, in baseball history between Joss and Walsh. Like two heavyweight boxers, I guess, with all the pressure in the world. And the dude just went out there and dealt. Top 10 games in Cleveland baseball history. You'd have to put that perfect game in there.
Yeah, and I've heard Joss's delivery compared to Hideo Nomo, if you guys remember him. He would turn his back to the plate, sometimes facing second base, and then whirl around and unleash a sidearm delivery to the plate. Hall of Famer Bobby Wallace said, Joss sort of hid the ball on you. One moment you'd be squinting at a long, graceful windup, and the next instant, out of nowhere, the ball was hopping across the plate. And a lot of us were caught standing flat-footed with our back glued to our shoulders. So that's kind of what it was like to face Addie Joss. Like we mentioned, he turned 31 on April 12th, 1911, and died 2 days later. His funeral was held on April 17th in Toledo, the same day the Indians were scheduled to open the season against Detroit. And American League President Ban Johnson ordered the Indians to play the game, but they refused. George Stovall, the team captain, said that the team was on strike, and they attended the funeral. Johnson had no choice but to postpone the game. Stovall told reporters, "No better man ever lived than Addie." And Napoleon Lajoie added, "In Joss's death, baseball loses one of the best pitchers and men that has ever been identified with the game." And like you mentioned, they had that benefit to raise money for his family. The Cleveland Plain Dealer called it the greatest array of players ever seen on one field. Box seats cost $1.25 each, and bleacher seats were 25 cents each. More than $11,000 was raised in ticket sales, and nearly another $2,000 was raised from special donations, including one of $25 from Connie Mack. The total raised was basically the equivalent of more than $375,000 today for his family. So pretty cool event. Definitely go Google some pictures of that, and I'll throw some up on the liner notes on the website as well. From 1912 to 1914, the team was renamed the Cleveland Molly Maguires. Everyone still called them the Naps.
Yeah, I've never been able to confirm any of that. Like, I've never seen that in print anywhere. So it's on the bucket list of things to dive into, but I've just never been able to confirm any of that. So if someone has that in print somewhere, I'd love to see it, but I just haven't been able to confirm that.
Yeah, I had never really seen any verification of that either. But if it's true, I have so many questions. Like, one, what the heck is going on? Like, how often do they need to rename this team? But two, Napoleon Lajoie was still on the team, so why would they rename it from the Naps if he's still on the team? And three, where would that name have come from? But I digress. In 1915, Lajoie did go back to Philadelphia to finish out his career, so Cleveland then wasn't going to keep their team named after someone who wasn't on their team anymore. A poll in the Cleveland Plain Dealer chose to name the team the Indians, supposedly in honor of Louis Sockalexis. Or was it? Sports writer Joe Posnanski and history professor Jonathan Zimmerman both dispute the idea that the Indians' name was meant to honor a player who played less than 100 games over 3 seasons with technically a completely different franchise. So what do you think is the real story of how the Cleveland Indians got their name?
So it goes back to the gray area and the context, and there's a lot that would go into it, and we look for things to be direct causes. And with history, whether it's baseball or whether it's the Civil War or whatever, it's difficult to say with any certainty X is because of Y. And I guess without going too deep into anything, there's just a lot of gray area in there. So
there's some speculation that they were renamed the Indians because the Boston Braves had just done so well. So
I think if you put yourself in the shoes of the people making the decisions, right? There's just the World Series was a much more watched event. There's just a lot going on in the atmosphere, so to speak. So the gray area and the context, I think there's just a lot going on to make people think the way they think.
So one of the best players from the 1910s was Jack Graney. He was a left-handed left fielder, and he was essentially the unofficial team captain, right?
Yeah, again, one of those guys that everyone loved, Canadian, the legend of, he started off as a pitcher, and as the story is, he ended up hitting Lajoie in the head with a baseball, and the next day Knapp's like, hey, the West is where wild guys go, and you're pretty wild, so here's your train ticket, go out West, learn to pitch, or something like that. But there's never an indication in the newspapers that this event happened. Now, It's not to say it didn't. It just maybe wasn't recorded. But if Jack swears by it, and it's reprinted several times throughout his lifetime and never refused it, so unless he just loved a good story, or maybe he almost hit Knapp in the head, or maybe there's something there. But I was never able to find any sort of abrupt you're gone, go out West story, but it sounds good.
Yeah.
It comes back as an outfielder, and his pitching days are long behind him. He might actually have an appearance here and there. I'd have to check Baseball Reference, but kind of transforms his career, goes reverse Bob Lemon, and goes from pitcher to outfielder, and has a solid major league career. Guy that everyone loves. Has maybe I'll beat you to the punch. Has a dog.
Yes, let's talk about Larry the dog.
What a fascinating creature. Larry was a bull terrier. So the early stories, like there's this dog, and there was a local trainer or someone in one of the bellhop got this dog and gave it to Knapp, or Knapp gave it to them. And somehow Graney came a hold of the dog, and there was a legal case in terms of ownership, I think, when Larry started getting a little more famous. But Jack was able to train this dog to play leapfrog and do all these tricks before games. So he became this fan favorite event before games. And again, you think about baseball in that era, there's no scoreboards to keep people entertained. And in between lulls and stuff, I mean, the dog was in team photos. I think it sat in the dugout. There are stories where he interrupted games by running to get the ball, kind of like you see with the minor league bat dogs, I guess. And there's another story where the dog was able to get on the boat in Cleveland and go up to St. Thomas, where Jack was from, and knew where to get off and would walk to the house. And at one point they were in D.C. visiting the president. That story's funny because you read the clipping, and a few players, I don't know if it was Joe Jackson or Lajoie, where it was like, no, I'm getting my hair cut. I'm getting a shave, so I don't want to go meet the president. But Jack goes, and I think it was Woodrow Wilson. He's like, I want to meet the dog my daughter's been telling me about. And Larry rips off to chase a squirrel up a tree. But go through old team photos. He's a cool-looking dog, and it was a newsworthy notice when he was doing what he did at games.
Yeah. Not only was Jack Graney, though, a part of the team as a player, but he eventually became the play-by-play broadcaster for the Indians from 1932 to 1953. He was actually the first former Major League Baseball player to become a radio broadcaster in the United States. What is his legacy here in Cleveland?
There's still people around, on Twitter, I put it out there, that were talking about, oh yeah, my dad or my grandfather told me about listening to him. And like you said, first player turned broadcaster, and really paved the way for guys you see now that have done that now.
Like the great Alex Rodriguez.
So you think about, if Jack didn't do it, I'm sure someone else would have done it. But, if Jack would have failed miserably, like maybe it would have caused a halt with that. But he kind of won in cold turkey. He had a car dealership that during the Depression kind of suffered, and there's a few different stories of how he got started, but just kind of popped on and was broadcasting right off the bat with no background in it, no nothing. But you read about what he was doing, and I was talking to Rosie about it, our radio broadcaster, and he very much mimics what you see today. The Plain Dealer mentions how professional he was. He would be at the field early to talk to players on both sides to get color commentary he could use during the game. And he knew the ballparks too, so that, was mentioning how his background as a player was very helpful to describe the events going on. And he was aware of his limitations. There's a story he made a mistake and called himself out on the air. At the time too, they weren't traveling for away games, so he had to recreate games at various parts. He even did one at Cedar Point, and there was a story about that. But he was more like ticker tape telegram stuff, and there's this connection there where he would say, oh, so-and-so's warming in the bullpen. Well, he didn't know that. It was just kind of adding spice to it. And, it's funny how the past resembles the present. In 2020, when our broadcasters couldn't travel, they were doing kind of a similar thing, and how difficult that was to watch a game and call it. But Jack did a game that we played against Brooklyn in Havana. So, this Canadian broadcaster, former player, doing an international game in Cuba. And, he did other sports. He did hockey. He did boxing. Interviewed Jesse Owens, amateur wrestlers. He was everywhere. And for a guy that had no background, no training, no whatever, and interestingly enough, I think it was his second year broadcasting. He was in a horrible car accident, and his face was pretty mangled. So when he was retiring in 53 and they had Jack Greeny night, he mentioned like, hey, people always ask me why I have this big pitcher of water even on cold games. He's like, my face was damaged and like I need to lubricate, and like he was fighting issues he had from that car accident. So to not just hang it up after that, I think is a testament to how much he cared about things, and people loved him. And I think with any broadcaster, you know, especially of your youth, you kind of get that soft spot in your heart for them, and change is always different. So for us, I mean, after Jack, there was Herb Score, and so many people remember Herb, and there's something about having a guy that's been with the team as a beloved player, then as a beloved broadcaster, that kind of cements your legacy.
Yeah. League Park was rebuilt using concrete and steel, like we mentioned, in 1910. This was the version of League Park that remained until it was eventually torn down. What were some of the unique characteristics of this version of League Park?
League Park in general is kind of like a reverse Fenway. You had this big wall in right field where you could throw your worst outfielder and just kind of put his back against it, because it was 290 feet, but I think it was like 45 feet tall. But you kind of had these weird girders in there that if the ball hit, it would ricochet and go wherever. And there's stories, I think it was Wamby at second, where you see a ball hit out that way. If you're second base, you're taking off and trying to help the right fielder play off any sort of weird ricochet. But it was kind of a unique looking right field in that it was built into the city, and it was this short but high wall. And if you go there now, you can see there's a replica of that wall, and it's intimidating. And it's the same wall where Babe Ruth hit his 500th home run over. But then you start going to center field, it's deep. I think it's like 420, 440, something extremely deep. And you know, it's one thing to hear numbers, but when you actually go stand out there, it's like, holy crap, you know, if this ball gets by you, it's rolling to the wall. And with Tris Speaker and stuff, I mean, that guy was able to turn unassisted double plays. You know, I think he had 4 or 5 of them at League Park, which is gutsy as hell, because, again, if you're able to turn an unassisted double play, it means you're playing pretty shallow or you're just super fast.
Right. Or in his case, both.
Yeah. You know, if that ball gets behind you, that's easy home run. And then, you know, left field's more just general, your run-of-the-mill left field. Again, mentioning Brian Powers, Bandbox Baseball, he did this 3D recreation using blueprints, digital newspapers. You couldn't do what he's doing 30 years ago. And using these blueprints, he's able to create views of League Park that, you know, no one took a picture from the bathroom or something like that. Like, why would you? But one of the odd things he was able to find is that the men's restroom still had kind of like a window to the field, and like different areas of the ballpark that there are no pictures, but through the blueprints. And he mentioned that they used some of the older parts of the Wooden League Park as a footer or something like that, buried underground, and just these odds and ends. But those quirks there make it, you know, it's not quite the Polo Grounds or anything, but it's one of those, luckily for us, never built over ballparks that you'd lose the ability to stand out there and kind of gain a presence. And I think sense of place is such an important part of history, and I think that's why people love Progressive Field so much, is that we've had 3 World Series, 2 All-Star games, a bunch of amazing walk-offs, and just the 22-game win streak. Like, being here and just having that feeling, you know, attraction. That's why I think when people see photos of Municipal Stadium, there's that longing for, you know, the feeling you had when you were at that old place, whether it was for the Browns or for baseball or for one of the rock concerts. But, you know, with League Park, there's that sense of place too with history. You know, that 1920 World Series is so interlinked to League Park, but it was home to some great events. And, you know, the Cleveland Buckeyes in the 45 Negro League World Series, you know, they played there. And granted, the last game played there was 47 or whatever, and there's not very many people around that would have sat through a game there. But it's like a national park, you know, in a sense. You know the giants that have walked there, and you can stand in the same batter's box, and it's a pretty cool piece of history.
As financially successful as Charlie Summers had been at the start of the 20th century, by 1915 he was in trouble. Summers' financial trouble forced him to make a decision. He had 2 really good players on his team, but couldn't afford them both, so he had to pick one to build his team around and one to sell or trade. First of all, what happened that got him in that financial trouble, and who were the 2 players that he had to decide between?
Summers had financial investments in an array of different areas, but I think it was the coal industry kind of took a hit. And in between that, I think he had a divorce going on too, and just wasn't the best situation for him. He was kind of just spread thin. So he had Ray Chapman and Shoeless Joe Jackson that he was trying to kind of weather the storm. And, you know, there was support from the other owners in the league too, and Ban Johnson. They didn't want to see Summers sell. I mean, they were trying to go through the papers too. It mentions all that of, well, we're going going to try to figure it out and help him weather the storm. But
well, he's the guy who basically made the American League possible with
Right.
his financial contributions.
Right, so it's kind of like, yeah, we owe you to keep it going, but long term it wasn't meant to be. But it came down to Chapman and Jackson, and it's one of those great what ifs of baseball history. I mean, what if Jackson stayed and Chapman left? Chapman definitely wouldn't have died. Like, you'd probably say it with utmost certainty, and then Jackson would be in the Baseball Hall of Fame. It was tough because you look at the papers, and people really loved Chapman. They loved Joe insofar as he was a great player, but I don't necessarily know if it was the same kind of love that they had for Chapman, who was, from all indications, just a bubbly, great guy, sings songs, was really like a glue of a clubhouse. But Jackson was pretty upfront with it, too. I mean, I think he's quoted saying, hey, Cleveland treated me fairly, but I'm excited for this new opportunity to go to Chicago. Because we more or less stole him from Connie Mack. Connie Mack made some really bad trades with Cleveland, and, Shoeless Joe being one of them, and Steve O'Neill and Charlie Jameson. So really, really poor trades. And, I think they were pretty upfront with him. And, I think he had just signed a new contract not too long before that. But business is business. He was ready to go on his way. And everyone thinks of Shoeless Joe as a Chicago guy, which, that's when he made his biggest splash, for better or for worse. But, he's got some Cleveland records.
People say that Joe's first 3 full seasons in baseball may be the best 3-year run in history. Sounds like hyperbole, but
his rookie batting average was what, like 4 something?
408, the highest in history. From 1911 through 1913, he led the major leagues with 656 hits. He slashed a 393 batting average, a 462 on-base percentage, and a 574 slugging percentage with a 192 OPS plus those 3 years. He averaged 219 hits, 43 doubles, 21 triples, and 6 home runs. Remember, this is the dead ball era. He also averaged 119 runs, 81 RBI, 34 steals, and 320 total bases per season. He averaged those numbers in his first 3 full seasons in the majors. Not to mention, in those 449 games and 1,917 plate appearances, he struck out only 87 times in 3 seasons total.
And I don't know what... Because Cleveland knew he was a great hitter. Again, you go back and the scouts down there were like, this guy is fantastic. We need him. I don't know what Connie Mack's, usually you're like, no, this guy's untouchable. I don't know if it was the fact whether he was homesick or something like that. And I'm sure there's more to the story than that. But, the Cleveland scouts like, we have to get this guy. And what was it, Brislord or whatever they traded for him? And I think he had 3 seasons after that or something. You're more of the Shoeless Joe guy than I am. So I don't know. I'm sure there's more to it than just that. But on the surface, it's just like, what?
Well, Joe grew up in South Carolina. He started working in the cotton mills at the age of 6, never went to school a day in his life, never learned how to read or write. Connie Mack was famous for wanting his teams to be full of not just high school educated, but college educated players. Most of them happened to be from the North. So Joe Jackson, this uneducated Southerner, comes up to Philadelphia. The first time in his life he's out of South Carolina, and he's on this team full of guys who he is nothing like. Doesn't fit in, doesn't know how to read or write, so they go to team dinners and he's holding the menu upside down because he doesn't know what way right side up is. His teammates make fun of him, things like that. So it just wasn't going to work out in Philadelphia, and he and Connie Mack kind of both knew that and understood it. And so it was really an act of mercy on Connie Mack's part to trade him someplace else, because he knew that, this guy is going to be great, but it's not going to be here.
That's why I ask you.
So we know that Joe lived at 7209 Lexington Avenue when he played with Cleveland. That's less than 2 blocks away from League Park. Where did most of the players usually live, or were they kind of scattered all over? Was it strange for a player to actually live full-time in Cleveland if they weren't from Cleveland? Or did most players live in hotels or apartments during the year and then move back to their off-season homes? What was going on?
That's one of the things that, I find the most interesting, trying to find those connections to the city, because I like that built environment, the actual connection to a physical location. And I think Joe's house is a vacant lot now, which is unfortunate. And, the Ray Chapman house that him and his wife were building is still there, but the house that the Daly family lived in is a vacant lot. And unfortunately, you run into that stuff a lot. But if you go on, I'm going to plug my Twitter account, @JFeador. I ended up coming across a story, it was in the 70s, where there was this gentleman. I said, hey, my mom ran this boarding house back in the day, and this is where, Ray Chapman stayed and where Tris Speaker stayed. It's this duplex and blah, blah, blah. And it's a vacant lot now, but thankfully through Twitter, there's enough people that are helpful out there. Yeah. We were able to figure out that this story mostly holds up. And one of the things he says that I find fascinating, too, is that Ray Chapman had a tattoo of a bird on his shoulder, which is the only time I've ever heard that. But if this story already has enough legs to it, he very well could have had this tattoo. So if you go on my account and look for that, there's this whole thread of this location. And through the county archives, I was able to find a picture of the house, which again was a couple blocks from League Park. So it's definitely not out of the realm of possibility. Now, tracking down and confirming the story, you do run into issues, and you go to look at the census records from 1920. Well, Tris Speaker's census records from Texas, even though they're playing in Cleveland, and Speaker ends up living in Cleveland after his playing career. But you look for some of these guys, and Wamby lives in Lakewood. But some of these guys, through whether it was a draft cards, Chapman ended up marrying a Cleveland girl and has the Cleveland addresses through the Daly family. But a lot of them just have their home addresses. So trying to pinpoint, because again, this is stuff that people aren't necessarily recording because it's just a ho-hum of regular life. And if you're not buying a house, well, then you have no paper trail of where you were living because there's no deed. Going back to the Delahantes, they're one of the forgotten families of Cleveland. I think 5 of the kids played baseball, and tracking down where they live, which again now is a vacant lot as well. Trying to find these places where average life took place, because again,
it's part of the story.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not going to change history, but it's cool to know that, hey, this is where the guys lived. This is how, they got to the ballpark. Because, again, guys aren't necessarily driving cars to the ballpark and doing that. But trying to find those boarding houses is very difficult unless you luck out and find some sort of instance where there's a recorded. So, again, needle in the haystack baseball research that I think so many people, especially Sabre members, are fond of.
Yeah.
So, on my Twitter account, there's the one. I'm not sure who else they said lived there, but Speaker and Chapman are good enough names for me.
James Dunn came in to save the franchise in 1916 and said that if everyone is patient, I'm going to bring a championship to Cleveland. Who was James Dunn, and what was his first real big move?
James was from Iowa, and he ended up getting a syndicate of guys together, and I think Ban Johnson kind of helped out with that too. And kind of odd, because Cleveland had enough people, I think, in that era that probably could have picked up the team too. Nevertheless, he's kind of the name that emerges when Summers is more or less forced to sell. And like you said, he's like, all right, well, we're going to try to make moves. I want to bring a championship to Cleveland. And the big move is Tris Speaker, and everything leading up to 1915 into Summers, it's just like a perfect storm. So you have the Federal League in 1915 that drives up salaries. So Speaker's getting paid well by Boston, and then 1916. They don't want to pay him as much as he was making because there's no threat of him leaving to go, was it 16 or 7?
I think it was $18,000 for the Federal League, and he was making $9 with Boston.
Right. And so after the Federal League, the writing's on the wall that it's folding, Boston's like, well, we're not going to pay. It's always funny you hear these stories like, your numbers weren't as good as they were last year, and he's batting like .330 or something like that. It's like, oh. So Speaker's kind of like, he's holding out, and they don't have a contract set for spring training with Boston. They're like, hey, just come to spring training, play. We'll hammer something out before opening day. So he's like, fine. So he's doing it. Last spring training game, I think they're playing an exhibition game in Boston or somewhere out there, and he's like, all right, we'll hammer it out. And he's in his hotel room, and the story goes, one of the writers from Cleveland was aware of Speaker's contract issues and this and that, and told the Cleveland guys, hey, go check on Boston with Speaker. They might be wanting to get rid of him because he's holding out. And the long and short of it is Cleveland's able to make a deal with Boston to bring Speaker to Cleveland, which again is on par with the Lajoie to Cleveland thing. This is the biggest name, one of the top 5 biggest names in baseball, one of the top center fielders of all time. And Speaker was really pissed. He didn't want to come to Cleveland. He was happy in Boston. He didn't think Cleveland had a great team, and refused to go. He was pissed at Boston. He wanted some of the money that Dunn was giving them, and it's like, I'm not going to play to you. Give me some of this money. And I wanted to come from Boston, not from Cleveland. Mm-hmm. And it runs up to the opening day where it's like, we don't know if Speaker's going to be able to be in the lineup that day. And it's like a movie. They hammer out this deal. I think it was at the Holiday Inn Hotel, and they rush Speaker to the ballpark for opening day. And I think he's probably literally putting his belt on as he gets out to the field to Cleveland, and it grows on him. It's funny because the fans were upset because Speaker played such a shallow center field that they were so used to talking to players in the outfield, and they're like, we can't talk to him, he's too close in. And it's kind of the perfect storm for him too. He's this rough and tumble kid from Texas who is cutting his teeth in Boston, wins a couple World Series, and I think he's matured to a bit where it was perfect timing to come to Cleveland. And you have World War I come around, and Speaker helps the team drill, because all these teams have to drill and be ready in case they need to go to the war and whatnot. And Speaker ends up going to flight school down in Florida, I think. but he's never needed to go overseas, which would have been, I mean, if Speaker was a pilot in World War I, he probably would have died. I mean, the lifespan is not very long for a pilot in World War I, but I think you see this growth as a leader, and the writing's kind of on the wall that Speaker is eventually going to be the player manager for the club. And there's a story where, was it Lee Full, I think was the manager at the time, and Cleveland's playing this game in 1919 against Babe Ruth, and they're up by like 3 or something like that, and Ruth's at the plate, and then Speaker would help with making decisions, but when Full comes out, he signals for a left-handed pitcher or something like that. That guy hadn't pitched like in 2 weeks because he had been hurt, and there was like a cross-up in what they wanted, so they bring the wrong guy in, and he gives up a grand slam, and that day Cleveland loses, and Full is fired, and Speaker reluctantly, air quotes around that, becomes player manager. So again, that sets kind of the stage for 1920 as this first season as full-time player manager. But I guess with any baseball story, you can kind of massage it to make it kind of sound like a movie. But for Speaker, it's a great story arc. I mean, just as this guy at this point in his career, he's prematurely gray, so he kind of looks like an old wise, the Gray Eagle as his.
Yeah, that's where that nickname came from, right?
Yeah, but he does look like an old man.
From 1916 to 1926, Tris was with the Cleveland Indians. He was a left-handed center fielder. He's Major League Baseball's all-time leader in doubles, and I feel like he's one of the greatest players who's ever lived, and rightfully inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1937. People ask me all the time about Joe Jackson going into the Hall of Fame, assuming that would be the best thing for his legacy at this point. And I always bring up people like Tris Speaker or Rogers Hornsby or Sam Crawford, these guys who were Joe's contemporaries, who were incredible ball players, and they were all inducted into the Hall of Fame, but now 80 years later, nobody really knows anything about those guys. And I feel like one of the reasons we still talk about Joe Jackson is because he's not in the Hall of Fame. And of course, while we believe he deserves to be honored in that way, he's probably more famous not in the Hall of Fame than he ever would be if he were inducted at this point in his history, like all of his contemporaries. When it comes to Tris Speaker, though, he was more than just a great player. He was also their manager and led them to their first World Series in 1920, but like most people, Speaker's legacy is complicated. There have been allegations that Speaker was a member of the KKK, but his supporters note that he was a staunch supporter of Larry Doby's when he broke the American League color barrier in 1947, working long hours with Doby because he was a former second baseman. He was being moved to center field, and so Speaker taught him how to play the outfield. What can you tell us about what Tris Speaker's teammates and the players he managed thought about him, and what also then do you know about the Dutch Leonard affair?
Yeah, so Speaker is definitely a complicated individual. Now, the KKK thing came from a story that I think it was after he was already dead. Some guy's like, yeah, Speaker told me that. And I just don't know. Like, it's tough to have these stories after guys are dead because they can't,
Right, confirm or deny.
And, I mean, there's no paper trail, there's no contemporary evidence. But then again, the contextual evidence of the time, there were a lot of guys that were part of groups like that. So I'm not trying to make excuses one way or another. I just, from the history point of view, you try to find where this stuff stems from. And, there's stories of Speaker being anti-Catholic. Well, he ended up marrying a Catholic girl. Like, if he was X, Y, and Z, I think you see him grow throughout his life. Like you said with Doby, he mentions that this guy's going to be a great outfielder. And, he was very, very complimentary of Larry Doby. So, and again, he becomes this player that, is an ambassador for the team too. There's a great picture of Feller warming up during the 1948 World Series. And in the background is just kind of Tris Speaker staring. And he did so much work for, I think it was Camp Cheerful around here that was a summer camp for individuals that had disabilities. And, he never had kids of his own. So he was always out in the community, and like Joe Jackson, I think he dealt in liquor as well, but he was a presence in the community, and he fell off a ladder at his house at Shaker Heights and cracked his head. And so his house from his later years is still standing, going back to that. And I recently came across some stories about he lost his dog, and I was like, oh no, I hope he found his dog. And then you look at like a few months later, he's got a second dog, so clearly the other dog never came back. And then like another year or two later, he had another dog, so I was like, oh no, he's just bad at being a dog owner. Holy smokes. But yeah, there's a few biographies out about Speaker, and very complex individual, and that's why I think I find him fascinating. I mean, the story when he was a kid is he broke his right arm and learned to throw left-handed, and that's why he was left-handed. He was riding a Bronco or something like that, and just, I think it was McGraw or somebody tried to come up with, and he pushed him to the side and said, you're not going to make it on our team. And was it the Giants that were down in Texas, I think? Like a lot of those guys at this time, very rough and tumble individuals. So, yeah, there's definitely stories about him that are out there that, I would love to know more one way or another, confirmation, I think.
things because, again, that's his life, his story. And, Dutch Leonard affair, I think it was 1918 that
1919.
Okay.
Yeah.
Both Cleveland and Detroit were out of playoff contention, and Speaker and Smokey Joe Wood and Cobb and Dutch Leonard making a side thing that if you guys win here,
the context is, back in this time, there were no playoffs in baseball. So if you had the best record in the American League or the best record in the National League at the end of the season, you just went to the World Series. But they would give bonuses to the teams who finished in second place or third place. And so coming into the last day of the season, players were often manipulating the last games of the years. Either teams in last place would throw those games because they were meaningless, so they would bet or strike out a certain number of times or whatever. So, gambling was rampant in baseball. A lot of people think that the 1919 White Sox were the first and last team to ever throw a game. Nothing could be further from the truth. So that same year, 1919, the Dutch Leonard affair happens.
Yeah, and it kind of gets overshadowed by the World Series. And later on, 1926, Leonard gets pissed, I think, and comes forward with documentation. And it forces Cobb and Speaker to leave their respective teams. Speaker never again manages a baseball team. I think he wants to, is never able to get back into that. He still works with the club later on.
But what happened, though? And so Cobb and Speaker kind of met before the last game of the season.
Oh, yeah. I think Detroit needed to win to finish higher and
get the bonus.
Right. I think they tried to put money on it too. Again, it's such a...
The allegation is that not only did they manipulate who won that game, but that they tried to place bets on it once they had agreed, well, if Detroit's going to win and we're going to make sure that happens, we might as well make some money off of it and bet knowing that Detroit's going to win. The story is that they didn't get the bets in quite in time.
Yeah, and they didn't get the money.
But there are these letters that Dutch Leonard and Tris Speaker and Ty Cobb kind of all sent to each other, confirming beyond a shadow of a doubt that they tried to do this thing.
Yeah, and then, stuff becomes public, and, for Kennesaw Mountain, I think it's just a headache, too, of, not this again. And, again, these are two of the biggest names in baseball, so it's can it be any worse? And Dutch kind of disappears too. He doesn't come forward after a certain point, and it boils down to, that's why both those guys finished their careers with someone other than the teams they're, in the Hall of Fame with.
Right. Because they were forced to, quote unquote, retire.
Right.
And then they came back with other teams
for the tail end of
right.
After the White Sox stuff. It's just let's try to
sweep it under the rug.
Yeah.
Another player in Cleveland's great history from this era was Ray Chapman. We've brought his name up a bunch of times. A lot of people do know how his story ends, but let's talk about it a little bit before that. He played for the Cleveland Naps and Indians from 1912 to 1920. Jack Graney and Ray Chapman were roommates on the road, and Chapman was an infielder, primarily a shortstop, who had great speed. He had 4 seasons with 10 or more triples, 6 straight seasons with 20 or more steals, including 52 in 1917. He was a great team player, also leading the American League in sacrifice hits 3 times in his 8 seasons. And he was just a really well-liked teammate. Not only that, but his opponents liked him too. I mean, he was just well-liked. What happened August 16th, 1920 at the Polo Grounds?
So Cleveland goes into Polo Grounds. Yankees are still playing there. It's a pennant chase. It's been kind of back and forth all season. And I guess backstory is you have these polar opposites where you said, Chapman's this guy that's beloved by everyone. Mays is this guy that's kind of universally hated by most of his teammates.
Carl Mays, the pitcher of the Yankees.
Mays, yeah. And he has this bizarre submarine. And if you go on YouTube, you can dig it up. There's a video of it. And he almost literally scrapes his knuckles on the ground as he throws the ball. And he's hit guys in the head before. He's pissed off Ty Cobb to Speaker to everyone that, he's of the mindset that, hey, I'm a pitcher. I got to control the strike zone and control where I throw the ball. And you mentioned with Chapman, he liked to bunt a lot and led in sacrifice hits. So I think previously in the first 2 at-bats, Chapman had bunted or tried to. And it was kind of a rainy, grayish day. 1920, you're using a ball that's been manipulated. It's dirty. It's not like you see today. Chapman's standing there, and Mays comes and kind of whips the ball, and Chapman freezes. The ball hits him in the head, and there's varying stories. Some say that everyone thought it sounded like it hit the bat, and they fielded the ball and threw it to first, and then they saw Chapman kind of crumble down. And there's so much to get into with it, just in terms of was Mays intentionally throwing at him? Because, again, he had thrown at guys in the past. He had hit guys in the head before. It wasn't uncommon for guys to get hit in the head either. Speaker had been hit in the head a couple years prior where, he had to sit out a few games with a concussion and had some issues there. So, no one knew that Chapman was going to die from that. It was like, yeah, he's gotten his bell rung. We're going to take him back, take him to the hospital. But to make matters worse, they said Chapman was kind of towards the tail end of his career. He had just gotten married. His wife was pregnant. Again, everything that goes into making like a more dramatic movie was literally happening in real life. And, I was just recently part of a great documentary called War on the Diamond. If you have a chance to see that, it kind of goes into a little more detail about that day. But Graney and them, they get Ray back to Polo Grounds. You got to go to the center field to get to the clubhouse and goes to the hospital and really never, he comes to for, hazes, but he can't talk. And they more or less tell his wife, like, hey, you got to get to New York. It doesn't look good. He has surgery at like 3 a.m. to relieve pressure from his brain. And he passes away. And that really throws a wrench in Cleveland's season. They kind of hit the skids for a little bit. And I think if it wasn't Speaker at manager, I think that season might have fizzled away. But he was able to kind of rally the troops. It doesn't hurt when you're able to bring up a future Hall of Fame shortstop with Joey Sewell from Alabama. You have this green kid from the South who's able to come in, and speaking of strikeout records, I think he had one season where he struck out 4 times. Just an absolute phenom at the plate. But Chapman's funeral, big to do in Cleveland, and there's all kinds of stuff going on. Speaker and Steve O'Neill get into a fight. They're unable to go to the funeral. And then Ray is buried at Lakeview, which is kind of perplexing. His wife ends up remarrying, and they had the daughter that she was pregnant with. Well, his widow ends up, it's either suicide or an accident, taking poison, and then her daughter dies not too long after from typhoid or something of that nature. So absolute tragedies all around. And Ray's buried at Lakeview by himself. His wife's in another local cemetery with the kid. But lots of different odds and ends to that story. And overall, just an absolute tragedy. And he's buried at Lakeview, and it's one of those places where if you're coming to Cleveland for baseball, you stop at Lakeview because people leave mementos out there. And you have the Elmer Flicks, who people don't really know about, but you have the Ray Chapmans, and like you said with Joe, people remember him because of 1919. People remember Ray because of being hit in the head. You remember Bill Wamby because of the unassisted triple play. Like, it's one of those things where it's like there's much more to a career than just these one defining moments. But when you have the one defining moment, you tend to get remembered more.
Yeah. The team wore black armbands on their uniform sleeves for the rest of the season as a way to honor Chapman. I think that was the first time that had ever been done. We talked about the Addie Joss benefit game in 1911. 1917, there was another kind of all-star benefit game like for Addie. The 1917 game was played for Boston sports writer Tim Murnane. And before the game, they had a number of skills competitions. They had a fungo contest where you stand at home plate, throw the ball up to yourself, and hit it as far as you can. Babe Ruth won that contest. They had a throwing competition, and Joe Jackson threw a ball 396 feet 8 inches on the fly and won that contest. They also had a speed around the bases contest, and Ray Chapman won that contest. Not only was he invited to participate in that unofficial All-Star game, but he won the contest that they had to be the fastest player in baseball. He was a really good player, though. Do you think that Ray Chapman would have been a Hall of Famer had he been able to play out the rest of his career?
Probably not. I think he was towards the tail end of his career, and he had a wealthy father-in-law that was going to give him a spot in his business, and his numbers are good. I just think he had a lot of those intangibles that don't necessarily get you into the Hall of Fame, especially of that era. But, he's in our franchise Hall of Fame, and he's top 5 in stolen bases. I don't think he was the guy Lofton beat to get the record, but he was definitely up there. And that's always the fun debate. I'm sure you can make an argument that Chapman could be a Hall of Famer. I'd have to look at his defensive metrics, and I don't know how they stack up with some of the other guys from his era. But I'm never going to argue against the Cleveland guy getting into the Hall of Fame. So,
well, it would have been interesting because obviously when that happened in 1920, the Hall of Fame didn't exist yet. But if it had, I wonder if he would have been inducted relatively soon after, like Lou Gehrig had, or Roberto Clemente. And obviously, those guys had better career numbers, but Chapman was a really good player who died prematurely. So I wonder if they would have made that decision had they been given the opportunity.
Right, because they let Eddie Joss, he was very similar, just great career, but just missed the 10-season thing, and made the exception for him as well. Again, tragedy, but I'm sure if I studied his numbers a little bit harder, Jay Jaffe's got a great book, the Cooperstown Case book, but I don't think he mentions Chapman in there. But I'd be interested to know more. And again, I just kind of say no off the top of my head, but I could be off base a little bit.
Tell me the story about the plaque that's on display at the stadium now.
So we have a plaque in our Heritage Park, and very soon after he was killed, there's a committee that came together to memorialize Ray, and they raised all this money, and this plaque was then constructed, and I think it was 21 that they unveiled it. It's at League Park. It was at Cleveland Stadium somewhere. Someone said it was outside of a ticketing window, but when we moved to this ballpark, it was crated up. You're moving. You're just kind of throwing stuff places, and it kind of got shoved aside and kind of forgotten about till it was found in the mid-2000s, right around the time we were creating our Heritage Park. And the plaque was able to be restored and put out in the bottom level of Heritage Park. It's one of the things I like to tell people too. Like if you go to a museum, you can't touch stuff, but if you go to Heritage Park, you can touch the plaque that's over 100 years old. That's been at League Park, Municipal Stadium that your great grandpa might have seen
or touched.
Yeah. So it's a really nice plaque. It's kind of a direct connection to that history, and it's really great to see fans stop and look at it and get a sense of history with it.
This all happened again in 1920 season, and the White Sox had thrown the 1919 World Series, but they hadn't been caught or punished after the series. So they actually played almost the entire 1920 season with their team intact. Most people don't realize that. After the game on August 26, 1920, the White Sox were 77-44 and had a 3.5 game lead in the American League over Cleveland. During the span of the previous 4 years, so from August 26, 1916 through August 26, 1920, the White Sox never lost more than 4 games in a row. They finished second in the American League in 1916, they won the World Series in 1917, went to the World Series and lost on purpose in 1919, and here they are with a 3.5 game lead on August 26, 1920, with 33 games left to play in the season. So it's safe to say that it was a pretty great team and that Charles Comiskey had built the dynasty that he had set out to build. But from August 27th to September 4th of 1920, the White Sox lost 7 consecutive games, falling all the way down to 3rd place in the American League behind the 1st place Indians and the 2nd place Yankees. At the end of play on September 27th, 1920, the White Sox implicated in the Black Sox scandal were suspended for the rest of the regular season. They were 95-56 at that point, a half game back behind Cleveland for 1st place in the American League. With half their team missing, they lost 2 of their final 3 games of that season, finishing in 2nd place, 2 games back. So the Indians won the 1920 American League pennant, but there's a lot of speculation, especially recently, that the White Sox had thrown a bunch of those games down the stretch of the 1920 regular season. There's historians out there who have concluded that the Indians didn't so much win the pennant in 1920, but that the White Sox chose to lose it. I mean, 7 straight losses at a pretty critical moment of the season. What do you think about that? What do you know about that? What have you researched about it?
I think it was in one of the Sabre magazines where it said the White Sox were aware if Cleveland was winning, then they would win. But that's giving a lot of credit to the White Sox to be able to turn it on and turn it off. Now it's easier to lose a game, but I think that same article says, well, they were able to win when Cleveland won, or baseball's a hard enough game as it is. Now, I don't know. It's a cool story. You're saying this team has this ability to turn it on and turn it off like that. But baseball is baseball. We won 22 games in 2017, and we didn't win 22 games in a row the year before that, or the year before that, or the year before, yada yada yada. So baseball is quirky, and
I think it's much easier to lose games on purpose than to win. So I think that is more the speculation, is that maybe they could turn it on or off or whatever. But at this point, they had a 3.5 game lead with a month left to play. And all of a sudden, for the first time in 4 years, they go on this 7-game losing streak. So that's where the speculation comes from.
Right, and that's what's fun about baseball history is this ability to look at stuff and see anomalies. But again, I'm coming from the Cleveland perspective. I don't know. But I know the article in Sabre, I think, touches on both the winning and the losing.
Yeah.
But I haven't dug too deep into the 1920 White Sox. That I don't know what Shoeless Joe batted in that stretch. I don't know what was going on. But I think baseball in a bigger picture is an odd game where it's bound to happen, trying not to sound, super defense. I mean, it's just fun to look back at it. And it's an interesting argument to make. But then again, this Cleveland team is also a great team.
They went on to play in the 1920 World Series against Brooklyn. And after 4 games, the series was tied at 2 apiece. You've said that if you could go back in time and watch one World Series game, you'd like to be one of the 26,684 fans at Game 5 of the 1920 World Series at League Park. Why?
Yeah, Game 5 of that 1920 World Series, I think, is one of those fascinating games. And that game featured the first home run hit by a pitcher in a World Series, first Grand Slam hit in a World Series. and the only unassisted triple play in a World Series. And again, I don't know if that's because it's a Cleveland thing that it gets super sensitive to where things are portrayed, but it's a monumental history game, but I don't think you necessarily hear a whole lot about it. But yeah, it's just one of those games where I'm sure the excitement was through the roof.
And in such an important game.
Yeah.
I mean, game 5 of a series tied at 2. This was a big deal.
Yeah, huge. And, it's kind of back and forth. And Cleveland had been trying for so long to get a World Series, and it had come up short in 1908 with Lajoie as player manager. And that really kind of, I'm not going to say wrecked him, but I think it took some years off his life being the player manager during a pennant chase like that, because he ends up relinquishing that not too long after that 08 season. And 1910 has a resurgence as just a player, and that's why he has that last great hurrah of his career with the Chalmers race. And, then there's a few close calls. I think the 1918 season, the one cut short by World War I, Cleveland was surging, and the season just kind of ended, so they finished behind Boston. But they had all these close calls, and 20 was kind of the story arc, so to speak, of the Jim Dunn, Tris Speaker, yada, yada story. You have all these momentous moments in that Game 5, and then if there was a World Series MVP of that series, it was Stan Kovaleski, who pitches 3 complete games. I think he gives up 2 runs throughout it all, and just a complete iron horse. It's not very many guys that win 3 games in a World Series,
right.
So it would have been cool to see that.
Yeah. But the Indians rallied around their fallen teammate and did win the World Series for him. I'm sure it was a really emotional time for everybody. This was before teams gave their players World Series rings, though. That tradition didn't start until 1922 when the New York Giants gave their players rings after beating the Yankees. Do you know what the Indians gave their players for winning the 1920 World Series, if they gave them anything at all?
Various players got various things. I know Tris Speaker and someone else got a pocket watch, but that was during the series. Jack Graney's family has some sort of World Series ring, although I don't know if it was something Jack had done himself.
That's what happened in 1917. The White Sox gave their players fobs.
Yeah.
And Joe had his turned into a ring. So Joe's quote-unquote 1917 World Series ring exists, and we know where it is. I've worn it a couple times. It's incredible. But it's not really a World Series ring. So Joe and Katie never had any kids of their own, but he had a bunch of nieces and nephews. He was the oldest of 8. One of the nephew's descendants has it. It's really cool.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, someone has Tris Speaker's pocket watch, too. He ended up calling, and he's like, oh, yeah, I have this, blah, blah, blah. I said, oh, it'd be cool. If you ever have a museum, would you want to loan it? And he's like, no. I'm like, okay.
Had to ask.
Yeah, no, I don't collect myself, so that's why I like museums. You can see these things, and I think that's what's cool about baseball, and the stuff we're saving now is that we're able to get it out and fans can see it. Plaques are cool, don't get me wrong, but the actual ball or bat or cap is more powerful.
Yeah. You mentioned this earlier, the documentary that's called War on the Diamond, which centers around the Chapman incident, but it also really discusses how that was the start of the rivalry, which would last for the next 100 years between the Yankees and the Indians. Do you think that the Yankees are the Indians' biggest rival?
No one likes the Yankees if you're not a New York Yankees fan. So, I think you play long enough, you're going to develop situations where there's the unique, whether it's the Bug game or the George Steinbrenner connection. So I definitely think, they're up there, probably our biggest rival just from the playoff experiences we've had.
Yeah.
And then again, if Detroit's good and we're good, Detroit's a big rival. And you do love beating the Yankees just because of, all the World Series and all the success they've had and all the close calls and pain that we've had in the past. So, yeah, they're definitely up there, and nothing is sweeter than beating the Yankees.
There was a famous player for the Yankees in the 1920s and early 1930s named Babe Ruth. I'm not sure if you've ever looked at this guy's numbers, but they are unbelievable, as in they are not believable. In 173 career games at League Park, Ruth batted .372 with 46 home runs, 33 doubles, and 11 triples. He drove in 144 runs, he scored 147, and he had 394 total bases. But here's the insane part. He walked 177 times in 173 games, which helped him achieve a .528 career on-base percentage at League Park. .528! More than half the times he came to the plate over 173 games, he reached base. He holds the all-time record with a .689 career slugging percentage. Second place all-time is Ted Williams at .634, so more than 50 points behind him. But at League Park, he slugged .728. Cleveland pitcher George Yulee, who usually had Ruth's number, said that the hardest ball he ever saw hit was a line drive Babe hit at League Park. It was still rising when it hit the top of the screen near the scoreboard in center field, 460 feet away. Yuli said, "It was the most terrific hit I ever saw. It would have landed on East 79th Street, but the screen stopped it and he only got a double." And you brought this up earlier. Probably the most famous hit Babe ever got at League Park came on August 11th, 1929, when he became the first player in history to hit a 500th career home run. That happened over the right field fence at League Park. What can you tell us about that home run?
There's a weird story about the person that got the ball. It was
it was
either
a kid named Jack Geyser.
But then it wasn't a kid. Like trying to do the research, I've stuck my toe in the water, but someone else I think has done a more detailed look into it. And it wasn't a kid. It was actually like an older guy. I think they're from Tuscarawas County or down where Cy Young was from. That just happened to be up. And I don't know if it's ever been concluded or someone might have figured it out, but it's very hazy as to who the person was or what the exact story was. Because, when you see stuff like that and they name people, it's always like, oh, let me do some research. And yeah, the story about that person is very hazy because I think the name they give in the plain dealer doesn't sync up with other stuff. And I don't even know if that ball's at the Hall of Fame or where that ball lives. But again, one of those cool Indians-Yankee moments that took place at League Park. DiMaggio's last hit of the hit streak was at League Park. But yeah, someone figured out that story because I know it's somewhere. And it's just, when you have over 150 odd years of baseball history, man, there's just so much to forget.
Yeah, the story that I had researched, it was a kid named Jack Geyser, and Babe Ruth gave him a $20 bill in exchange for the ball, which was equivalent of more than $300 today. He also gave him an autographed baseball, which would be worth about $25,000 today, and they gave him a chance to sit in the Yankees dugout.
And if you think about it, if they get an autographed ball, I mean, that ball's worth more than your average Babe Ruth signed ball because of the context of the provenance of that ball. Like, that's the ball that was traded for the 500th,
right.
And the story attached to it. I mean, but...
If it's true.
Yeah.
And if we can prove it, and yeah. And that's one of the hardest parts of your job, I'm sure, is there's all these stories. There's 25 guys every year wore a uniform. How can we prove that this was Tris Speaker's 1917 uniform? Like, it's over 100 years ago at this point. Who knows what the provenance is? You have stories about the Hall of Fame accepting things from the Barry Halper collection, and they do forensic analysis on the uniform, and it was supposed to be Joe Jackson's 1917 World Series uniform, and the thread that they have connecting the logo to the uniform itself wasn't even invented until 1941. So, there are just so many opportunities to not have it be the piece.
And in our Feller exhibit, we have a ball. The story goes Feller signed for $1 in an autographed ball. And we have a ball we got from the museum, and it's autographed by members of the early 1930s Cleveland Club. And, I remember asking Bob's son, Steve, I said, Steve, is this the ball your dad would have gotten with that signing? He's like, well, I don't know for sure, but, I mean, it would fit the bill. So we display it as, not with certainty, like this isn't the ball, but it could be or it's similar to, because, again, without Bob and without any sort of indication otherwise, versus like the Gopher ball we have from Bob that was signed by Ruth and Gehrig, we know that that's the ball. Like, Bob's kept it in his possession. You can faintly see the autograph. It fits the bill. There's more certainty, but right. I mean, I had someone call up and said that they had the bat from Elmer Smith's Grand Slam and was trying to photo match it. It's like, well, you're not going to be able to photo match it just because there's not very many great photos of that moment. But I think you find that in collecting, especially with Cleveland stuff, if you find something, you want it to be connected to 20 or 48 because those are the two big years that we won the World Series. But just because you want it doesn't necessarily mean it makes it that way. So it's just that being careful about how you describe something. And actually, we talked about Ray Fosse. I remember talking to Ray at auction that said this is the jersey he was wearing when Pete Rose hit him, and Ray's like, well, that's not it. I know the guy that has the jersey. It's over, so and so. So it's like buyer beware.
Right. Always.
Yeah.
One of my favorite stories about Cleveland is the story of Hots Cafe, which opened in about 1919, we think, at the corner of Starkweather Avenue and West 10th Street in the Tremont neighborhood. What can you tell us about what is believed to be Cleveland's oldest tavern?
Yeah, I've been there and I've heard the stories. I know that like Babe Ruth and other players would attend there. Now,
from what I've heard, it opened before Prohibition, and somehow, I don't know if it operated as a speakeasy or what, but stayed open through Prohibition. All the visiting players knew that when they came through Cleveland, that's where they could go after the game to get a drink. They also knew that they were essentially drinking for free, because the guy who ran the bar would accept a check as payment, and he would never cash those checks because he wanted the signature. So Babe Ruth would give him a check signed Babe Ruth and know that it was really just a signature that he was exchanging for the drinks, that he wasn't being charged. They gave him a tab and he signed a check for the amount, but it wasn't ever going to be taken from his account. And so then it became like the place to go for athletes and for baseball players after the games, because they knew like we're drinking for free. It's going to be a good time. And then all of the fans started getting word of this, because if I can go to a bar after the game and drink with Babe Ruth, I'm going to do that. And so it became like this hot spot in Cleveland from what I've heard.
Yeah, like I said, I've been there a few times. If these checks still exist, I mean, that would be fantastic to see. And, that's the beauty, too, like we mentioned before, just these off-the-field baseball stories that, when you can confirm or find someone that knows more than you and then can fill you in, I think it helps fill in some gaps and add to the thread of the Cleveland baseball history garment, so to speak.
Yeah. So let's talk about another player in Cleveland's great history. From 1929 to 1939, Earl Averill played with the Indians. Another great center fielder. He kind of picked up where Tris Speaker left off. The first ever All-Star game in Major League history was in 1933 at Comiskey Park in Chicago, and Earl was selected as an All-Star every year from 1933 through 1938, when he was then 36 years old. He was top 10 in MVP voting 4 times and top 5 3 times. One of the original 10 inductees into the Cleveland Indians Hall of Fame in 1951. What can you tell us about Earl?
I think Earl is unfortunate in that he falls into this like no man's land of our history, because it's post-Speaker but pre-Feller. It's Cleveland baseball history where they're not winning World Series or anything, and they're just not. I mean, not to say they're not a super interesting team. I think every year has got its own quirks. But with Earl, I think he's got the coolest nickname. He's the Earl of Snohomish because he's from Snohomish, Washington. But yeah, he's just one of those solid players that's in the Hall of Fame. Fans look up, you can see his retired number, but he's just kind of lost in the shuffle of being sandwiched between these two great eras of the Speaker, Chapman, Wamby, Kovaleski eras, and then the Feller and those 40s eras, because he wasn't playing with too many other studs, so to speak. His family was in town, or some descendants, and I'm always interested to know what artifacts families have in their possession, and they still have. When they went overseas to Japan, and the catcher was a spy, I think.
Moberg.
Yeah. He was with
the 1934 U.S. tour.
Right. He was with that team, and they still have the full uniform and
cool.
Great people, and they still have his Hall of Fame clock he was awarded. And I think we'll get into the Hall of Fame discussion later. But when Cleveland had the Hall of Fame, that thing came together like very quickly, and Earl was able to fly in from Washington, like the drop of a hat, and it's like, holy smokes.
Yeah. Municipal Stadium was completed in 1931 and was designed for access by automobile. It held nearly 80,000 people, which for most of its tenure was the largest seating capacity in any major league stadium. And many people mistakenly believe that it was built in a failed bid to attract the 1932 Summer Olympics, but those games had been awarded to Los Angeles in 1923, long before ground was broken on the stadium. Another common misconception is that it was a Works Progress Administration project, but the WPA wasn't created until 1935, 4 years after the stadium was built. The stadium was built for football and for the Indians, and the Indians played all of their games at the stadium from the middle of 1932 season through 1933. Why did they stop playing their games there and then go back to League Park?
It's hard. It's a capacity issue. I mean, you're not going to be drawing 80,000. There's lease issues. In Scott Longert's book, Scott does such a good job of going into those misconceptions that this was part of the Olympic bid, this was part of X, Y, and Z. So there's a lot of intricacies. But, it was one of those things where if you knew you were going to draw a crowd that would be bigger than what League Park could hold, you'd want to do it at the ballpark because, again, it came down to money. And they obviously jumped back and forth up until 47.
Well, I had heard that it cost so much to operate because it was such a big stadium that like a Tuesday afternoon game, they're not drawing 80,000 people. So let's play that game at League Park. And basically the Indians continued to play their weekday games at League Park until 1947. But beginning in 1939, Cleveland Municipal Stadium began to host night games as well, and League Park never had lights installed. So all night games, most weekend and holiday games, or games where they expected large attendance numbers.
Yankees,
yeah. Those would be at Municipal.
Yeah, and it always boils down to money,
Yeah.
right? Kind of like the 20 World Series, it was 9 games. Why did the World Series go to 9 games? Well, extra games meant more money. You know, it's I'm lucky enough too. I'm old enough to remember vaguely going to games and bits and pieces of it, but it was huge, man. You see those pictures when the Yankees were in town or during the World Series, and 80,000 people. Man, it must have been a trip.
It's a lot of people. Are you a ballpark mustard guy?
I'd be in the right mood. I mean, I'll put whatever on hot dogs. Yeah, the Burtman stuff is solid. I'm a big fan of. Well, we have the Happy Dog here too with the Fruit Loops on it. That's a favorite of mine. So I'll throw anything on a hot dog.
Awesome. Another great player from Cleveland's history, 1938 to 1950, was Lou Boudreau. He was a shortstop. He was player manager from 42 through 50. He finished 17th or higher in MVP voting for every single year in the 40s, including 8 top 10 finishes. He had 3 top 5 finishes and actually won the award in 1948 when he had career highs in nearly every offensive category: hits, home runs, RBI, walks, batting average, on-base percentage, slugging percentage, OPS, total bases. It was a career year. And it ended pretty well, too. He was the pride of Harvey, Illinois, and the city had Lou Boudreau Day on October 28th, 1948, to honor him after he led the Indians to the World Series. What do we know about him?
An absolute fan favorite. There were talks when Vec came into town that he was going to get rid of Boudreau, and fans,
revolted.
Yeah. And he's in the Kid from Cleveland movie. So if you have a chance to catch that, it's a movie. It's cool to see all the old guys. Talk Speaker makes an appearance. Satchel Paige is in there. But yeah, again, Boudreau, he got a statue outside the ballpark not too long ago. That was really neat. His son-in-law is Denny McLean, so he was out there talking. It was really cool to meet the family and see the support for that. So we have a nice statue of Lou, and rightly so. I mean, again, especially for people of that generation where they loved him, very similar to those feelings of people have for Rocky Colavito or other. He was like the player that fans loved. And, when the old stadium was up, it was Boudreau Boulevard outside of it. And now it's since changed. But I know Paul Dolan, his father's favorite player, was Lou Boudreau. So again, a lot of guys from that generation love Lou. He kind of steered the ship during World War II. He wasn't able to serve. I think he had issues with his ankles.
Probably the most famous Cleveland Indian was Bob Feller. From 1936 to 1956, he was a right-handed starting pitcher. He began his career at the age of 17 before he finished high school, and at that time he was basically the equivalent of LeBron James. His high school graduation was covered by network radio. He had some great nicknames: Bullet Bob, the Heater from Van Meter, Rapid Robert, but he just wanted people to call him Bob. I mean, he was a pretty down-to-earth, humble guy. He served as an anti-aircraft gunner on the battleship USS Alabama in World War II, missing 4 years in the prime of his career, and yet he still won 266 games. An extremely conservative estimate is that he would have won another 70 if he hadn't left for that war. Some people think he would have won another 100 if he hadn't missed those years. Even still, he threw 3 no-hitters, including one on opening day in 1940 when he was only 21 years old, the only time there has ever been a no-hitter on an opening day. He also had another 12 one-hitters. Just how good was Bob Feller?
I think there was another opening day no-hitter in the Negro Leagues now that's considered a major league. But that's the only game where the opposing lineup has the same average at the start of the game and the end of the game. So if you want to win a bar bet, that's the only time it's ever happened. But yeah, I mean, gosh, I don't know where you start on Bob. I mean, it's just when you have a player that has such a dominant career in the city, then he sticks around in the city and it's just an ambassador and it's just the face of a franchise. And, like I mentioned before, there's some great pictures of Bob with Nap Lajoie and with Cy Young. So, like, Bob spans our entire history, which is stunning. And if you wanted a player that could represent your franchise, I mean, it's hard to ask for a better one than Bob, just in terms of his ability on the field. And there's a few biographies. I know I mentioned before Luke Epling's book, Our Team, that came out, does a great look at Bob and Dobie and Page and just how their personalities were different and it was kind of a different point in their career and how they approached stuff. And Bob understood his celebrity and knew that, hey, I have this career. I got to make the money while I can. He had candy bars. He was on all kinds of products, selling this and that. But, yeah, pitched some of the most memorable games in Cleveland history. Kind of got the raw end of the deal in the game 1 of the 48 World Series. He was never able to win a World Series game, which I think was, I don't want to say regret of his, but, you want to check off boxes if you can. And there was this pickoff play at second base. The runner was out, but they called him safe. That run scored, and they lost 1-0. But, he has the opening day no-hitter. His no-hitter against the Yankees, which is never a bad thing to have. And so many franchise records. It was fun because when we opened the exhibit and had Ann Feller here and Steve and the other brothers, Corey Kluber was pitching against the Cardinals and ended up striking out 18 Cardinals on that same day. So, tied Bob's record for most strikeouts in a 9-inning game. And Corey didn't come out for the 9th inning, which would have been interesting to see what he could have done. Mm-hmm. But so to have that kind of happen that same day, I think was really kind of like eerie in a good way. Just like, what are the odds? You know, again, you go to a baseball game, you never know what you're going to see. I think his no-hitter was broken up, too, by a former Cleveland, I don't know if it was Johnny Peralta or someone like that. It was just like, of course, it had to be another. Mm-hmm. 'Cause like I mentioned, I think Feller had a no-hitter broken up by Averill, and it seems to be the way that no-hitters are broken up by former players. But, I mean, Yeah, you could do a whole mini-series on Feller's career and service in the Navy, and the U.S. Alabama is a museum now, so you can go see his bunk, and we have some of his Navy stuff in our Feller exhibit. We have a jacket of his, and first player to get a statue at the ballpark, first number retired. We only have 2 first ballot Hall of Famers, Bob being the first and Tommy being the second. So he's definitely cemented his name in our record books.
Yeah.
But yeah, you wonder what would have happened those years, because when he left, he was at the top of his game. When he came back, I think his first game back was like a one-hitter night game at Municipal Stadium. So it's like, who knows what he would have been doing. That was literally the prime, I mean.
Right. The couple years before and the couple years after, he was averaging like 27 wins a game.
Yeah, he won a Triple Crown,
Right.
and it's just unbelievable stuff.
27 wins a season, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
When he was a high schooler, he came to Cleveland and pitched in an exhibition game against the Cardinals at a place called Brookside Park, which was like a huge natural amphitheater.
So Feller came up and pitched a few Sandlot games, but that was over on the east side where it's now like Luke Easter Park.
Okay.
Brookside Park is where there was a game between 2 amateur clubs where there were over 100,000 fans there.
Yeah.
But Feller had an exhibition game against the Cardinals there. Yeah, I think the story goes with one of the players. Feller had 2 strikes on the batter, and the guy walked out. And because you get one more strike, he's like, I don't need it or keep it or something like that. You have these stories.
Mm-hmm.
And Steve O'Neill was catching for him a little bit. He was the manager at the time for that exhibition game. And Feller never played a game of minor league ball, so it's pretty amazing to think. He's one of those players I think you could plop out of any era and put him in, and he'd still have success.
Yeah. Bill Veeck bought the team for $1.6 million on June 22nd, 1946. He saw 80,000 empty seats by the lakefront and decided he wanted all of Cleveland's home games played there again at Municipal Stadium. He saw that on Sundays, though, League Park hosted Negro League games that were really well attended, and that the talent in those games was crazy. I mean, he jumped into integration, and while the team's mascot may not have been super progressive, the front office was. They were the American League team which broke the color barrier by bringing in Larry Doby in July of 1947, about 11 weeks after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier for the National League in Brooklyn. But Cleveland was also the first team in Major League Baseball history to have a black manager when Frank Robinson was their player manager on April 8th, 1975 against the New York Yankees. Let's go back to Larry Doby, though. From 1947 to 1955, he played with the Cleveland Indians. He came back for one more year in 1958. Some people say he may have even had it harder than Jackie Robinson because Jackie played in Montreal in 1946, so he had a whole year of preparation for the treatment that he was going to face when he got to the majors, playing against white players in front of mostly white fans. But Doby was playing with the Newark Eagles of the Negro League until July 2nd, 1947, when he signed with Cleveland, and then he made his Indians debut 3 days later on July 5th at Comiskey Park in Chicago, becoming the first black player ever in the American League and the first player to go directly to the white major leagues from the Negro Leagues. He came up as a second baseman but moved to center field in 1948, where he would eventually become a 7-time All-Star. How did Doby's move to center change the team's fortunes in 1948 and beyond?
Yeah, you mentioned Doby. I mean, you read the story of when he came over. I mean, he literally finished the game with Newark, got on a plane, came to Chicago where we were playing the White Sox, and boom, thrown into the fire immediately. And it's just like, you can't imagine. And it'd be easy to think that, okay, he signed, he's with the team, and things kind of smooth out, but they never really do, especially in 1940s, 1950s America, of all the stuff that he had to deal with. But he does add that stability in the outfield. He starts off a little slow in 47, and I think his first at bat he strikes out, but he starts developing, and he becomes the perennial all-star, and could have won an MVP and had one of the biggest home runs in the 48 World Series. And to have Tris Speaker as your one of your coaches, I think, is an interesting connection. Speaker is arguably the greatest center fielder of all time. I mean, one of them, and going back to my job, is one of the coolest artifacts we have, I think, is that contract Doby signed in 47. Right now it's on display at Ohio History Center down in Columbus. They have a sports exhibit going on, but someone had the wherewithal to save that versus, with Frank Robinson, that lineup card he had, that first game when he was manager, we don't know where that went. No one seems to know where that went. So, but again, going back to Luke's book and Veeck's connection to all of this, I mean, Cleveland then picked up Page, and we're integrating faster than other teams with, guys like Luke Easter. And, Veeck's history with it may go deeper. He makes claims later on that he wanted to do, I think, in Philly or somewhere of that nature. I mean, Veeck was Veeck. He's definitely a once-in-a-generation kind of character.
Yeah. Well, you talk about Satchel Paige. 1948 and 49, he played with the Cleveland Indians, but he had previously pitched in Cleveland. In 1931, he was a member of the Cleveland Cubs of the Negro National League, where he had a 1.99 ERA plus, a .908 WHIP, and averaged 4.5 strikeouts for every walk. He was 41 years old, maybe, when the Indians signed him in 1948. Nobody's ever really sure how old Satchel Paige was, but a lot of people thought when he did sign that it was a gimmick, that it was a publicity stunt, that Paige was washed up, and Bill Veeck knew it, but he didn't care because he knew he was going to sell a bunch of tickets. He wasn't washed up, though.
I interviewed Larry Tye, who wrote a fantastic biography on Satchel Paige, and just it's difficult, I think, to understand Paige just from Wikipedia pages and through bits and pieces. When you get Larry's book, that's just such a concise documentation of Satchel's life, and he's such an interesting individual, and how he went about making a living and jumping from team to team. And it's hard to explain, I guess, or put into words what Satchel Paige is as a baseball player and the things he accomplished and the life he lived, because it's just extremely larger than life. And stories where he would call his outfielders in because he could walk the bases loaded and strike out the next three guys, and just these stories where it's like, that can't be real. But there's accounts, there's people that told these stories, and I'm at a loss for words at times too. Like, again, when I was finished reading that book, you just kind of sit back and you're like, what a life, what a career. Because again, he spanned decades, and Larry was able to find a record of his birth and pin down that year, so he has an exact age for him. And again, that was part of his persona. I mean, that was Satchel Paige, was this larger than life character, and he has all those great quotes and ways to live. So yeah, I think Satch is an incredibly fascinating person, and I'm not able to give him any justice here, and I'd highly recommend the book on him because it's just such a well-written, well-documented book. After this is done, hopefully you have a list of books that are rather large.
The Red Sox and the Indians tied for first place at the end of the 1948 season, so there was a one-game sudden death playoff. What happened in that game? It was played in Boston, right?
Yeah.
Fenway?
Guys came to play. I mean, Feller had lost the game previous to help Cleveland clinch. So they went out with Gene Bearden, who's a rookie at the time. He was actually an older rookie. He was a World War II veteran who actually had a metal plate in his head. He was on a ship that had blown up and had all these injuries. And you think of that generation, and they were just, I can't imagine after you've gone through that, a baseball game is any bit scary. But right. I think Boudreaux had 2 home runs that game. I think Boudreaux had 2 home runs and ended up beating up Boston pretty good to go to the second World Series. One of the more fascinating things, I have a buddy who's a ticket collector, and he's got a ticket to that game, and I think you only see a handful of those kind of still in
circulation.
Yeah. But Gene Bearden's story too is just fascinating. Again, he kind of very much like Ryan Merritt in 2016, where you have this kid come in, and his career is so short, but he pitches this game in 16 where fans will always remember him to get us to the playoffs, much like Gene Bearden, who after 48 really was never the same as he was in that 48 season. So baseball has got a way of making people into legends very quickly, and then chewing you up and spitting you out too.
Larry Doby and Satchel Paige were not chewed up and spit out. They were the first African-American players to win World Series championship when the Indians won in 1948. Doby also later became the second ever black manager in the majors in 1978 with the Chicago White Sox. When the team was going to rename, they were starting to talk about the possibilities of all the different team names. And one of the names that was suggested was the Buckeyes, but that wasn't in homage to the Ohio State Buckeyes so much as it was to their Negro League team that was called the Cleveland Buckeyes. Tell me a little bit about those Buckeyes.
Cleveland's Negro League history is like any city. There's teams that come and go. I mean, financial stability was difficult for a lot of these teams, and the historical record is littered with holes too, just because a lot of these things weren't captured. But in 45, the team ends up taking on the Homestead Grays, which were among the all-time great Negro League teams. Josh Gibson's on the team, and Cleveland was able to dominate that series. And again, I'm not my background in Negro League history isn't as strong as other areas, but one of my Sabre friends, Stephanie Lecicio, she has a book on Cleveland's Negro League history that documents as much as you can, I think, that's available in our history. Because, like you said, there's a variety of names, there's a variety of different teams that came and went, but they ended up winning that 45 series, and they played at League Park. And, after you have the integration with Doby and Page, Negro Leagues then start to fold. So that was kind of the apex, I think, of Cleveland's Negro League history, because I think the Buckeyes weren't too long in Cleveland after that World Series. But every once in a while in Detroit we'll wear the throwbacks that are really neat, and fans seem to really like those. But some of those guys, you see these names and there's just no information about them. The guys kind of disappear off the historical record, so doing that research is a bit tricky.
Yeah. The city of Cleveland bought League Park from the Indians. Did it happen in 1951?
I don't know what year. I know that the Browns had used it for a while as a practice facility, and then it became like a rec center-ish. I think there was a pool there. But that area of Cleveland then was part of the Huff riots, race riots at the time, and kind of fell into some disrepair.
The city of Cleveland demolished all but one side of League Park to create a playground. It's gotten a second life in the past 10 years or so. What has it meant to the city to have a baseball field back at that location? And then, like, when people think of League Park who are from Cleveland now, like, what do they think about it?
So there was a councilwoman named Fannie Lewis, I believe, and she was always trying to spearhead renovations. And, the field was there for a while, and some of the first base side, like the stands were still there for a little bit in the clubhouse, but those, again, fell into disrepair, and they had to knock those down. So you still have, like, the ticketing house and part of the wall, and then the rest has been kind of refurbished, recreated. But there's always Ohio Historical Marker outside of there, and it was a spot for kids to play. I think there were basketball courts at one time, but again, I don't know the ins and outs of what was happening in the 60s, 70s, and 80s there, and I think you see more of a spearhead with that stuff starting in the 90s and 2000s when Sabre was in Cleveland for the longest time. But it really takes a hold. The city knew it was an asset that you have this location that was such a big part of baseball history, and there's still parts of it that are still there. So they're able to put a few $1 million in it and get the field back together and put the wall and the outfield fence so you get an idea of what it looked like. And I think there's another field on the other side of it. So definitely it hosts events. When we had the All-Star game, there were baseball games being played there.
Cool.
When travel leagues come, I know they have games there. And there's the Baseball Heritage Museum that sits there. And they do a great job of just integrating that with the surroundings. And they do all kinds of workshops and book drives and movie nights. And Cleveland's opening up a library adjacent to League Park. And sometimes there's just people that don't know it's there or what its history is. So I always like telling people, like, yeah, go check it out. It's a great place to visit. It's a 6-minute drive from the ballpark with no traffic. So it's not very many places. You can't go to the Polo Grounds. You can't go to Ebbets Field. Detroit's done some stuff with Tiger Stadium, which is cool. But we're lucky that nothing was ever built over it, and you can still play on the field.
Yeah, absolutely. Back in 1951, the Indians spent about $25,000 to design a special S-shaped room on the lower level of Cleveland Municipal Stadium, which housed the Cleveland Indians Hall of Fame. It was the vision of the team's public relations director, Marshall Samuel, after visiting the National Baseball Hall of Fame. He convinced Indians Vice President Nate Dolan to create a museum for their own team's history. What were some of the pieces that we know were in there at some point?
I mean, we're the first team to have a team Hall of Fame and museum. And in that museum, they said that they had Wamby's triple play ball, Lajoie's bat, I think from 1904, Elmer Smith's Grand Slam bat, various odds and end uniforms. And supposedly somewhere there's an inventory that was a part of some catalog that came out when they opened the museum in the 50s. But again, a lot of the stuff it's gone. I think I've seen Lajoie's bat in a book in a private collection, but Wamby's triple play ball, I mean, once you throw it in a bucket with other balls, it becomes kind of lost to history because you can't prove, there's a thing in the museum world called provenance that you have to make sure you're absolutely sure. And with MLB's authentication, that's helped a lot. Now with those stickers, you're able to say conclusively this is the ball, and there's strict rules behind all that. But, when a ball goes in the stands, like Asdrubal Cabrera had the unassisted triple play, flipped the ball into the stands, someone caught it. That's great, and whoever has the ball has the ball, but it would be difficult to come out with it and say, this is the ball, I want to sell it for X amount of dollars, when it's like, or are you sure? Human memory's faulty, so like if you threw it on a dresser and with other baseballs and it fell on the ground and it got mixed up, like you may think but there's
no way to prove it with 100% certainty.
So where all the stuff went, because the museum ended up being boarded up in the 70s when the team wasn't doing too well, stuff might have walked away. There was the Ohio Baseball Hall of Fame. I know that they got some of the mannequins because I've seen the pictures and they photo match with the uniforms. Now, I don't know if those are reproduction uniforms or what, but trying to piece all that stuff together is just this large puzzle that's going on still. And if anyone, there's got to be pictures of it. We only have a handful of pictures, and I imagine people out there, if you're going to the ballpark, you might take a picture there. So I'm always looking for those odds and ends, and there's got to be something out there.
The inaugural class of the Cleveland Indians Hall of Fame included 10 former players: Shoeless Joe Jackson, Napoleon Lajoie, Tris Speaker, Cy Young, Earl Averill, Mel Harder, Ken Keltner, Steve O'Neill, Joe Sewell, and Hal Trosky. I have heard that originally Joe Jackson was not included on the ballot, and there was such an uproar from the fans that they had to put him on, and that he was then eventually voted in. Is there truth to that story that you've heard? And what did each of those 10 guys receive from the Cleveland Indians to commemorate their induction?
I don't recall coming across anything like that. I'm pretty sure he was on the ballot from the get-go, and there were a few stories written by the local writers like, hey, fans still love this guy, issues aside. So yeah, I think Joe was always on it, but I didn't see anything like, oops, we screwed up, we have to put Joe on it. I think he was always on there, but I mean, it could be proven wrong, I suppose, too, but I don't recall seeing anything of that nature. But when guys were voted in, they were given this nice clock that had an engraving, and thankfully for the Averill family, I was able to see what one looks like, and there's a few other ones that still survived. I forgot who else I was in contact with that the family still has it. But yeah, cool looking clock. I think a lot of them are lost to history, but some still survive. So, the story with Joe, he wanted to get to the Hall of Fame. I imagine that's probably the first Hall of Fame he got into, but he had suffered a heart attack, and doctor's orders were don't travel from South Carolina to Cleveland. Mm-hmm. So he wasn't able to make it, and they were going to have someone bring it down to him, or he was going to be on a TV show, and ended up dying in that December, and they were unable to get it to him, which would have been cool to have him back at Cleveland. I don't know if he'd ever been back to Cleveland, but fans were over the moon that Joe got voted in, and if you go to the ballpark, you can see his plaque in our Hall of Fame.
Yeah. The story was December 16th, 1951. He was scheduled to appear on a TV show called Toast of the Town, which was the precursor to the Ed Sullivan Show, but he passed away December 5th, so never had the chance to actually appear on that TV show. We do know that Joe and Katie were sent the clock. Katie got it after Joe passed away. There's a letter that explains why she's getting the clock and where it came from. We have a photo that was a Polaroid photo that appeared in the Jackson family scrapbooks that shows exactly where Katie kept it on the mantle. So we know that they had it at some point. Joe probably never saw it, but they did receive it, so that's pretty cool.
Players actually also, I think, got like an oil painting of themselves, too, because I know the Feller family still have theirs. I remember seeing it there.
Why did the Indians Hall of Fame stop existing for a while? And, where did all that stuff just disappear to without a trace? Did the team have any interest in keeping that stuff around, or were they just like, we're done with it? What happened?
I think it was one of those things where the team was just kind of hitting the skids in the 70s, and the 80s weren't much better. So you don't necessarily want to just dwell on the past, I suppose. And I can't speak for people that were here then, but then we move into Jacobs Field, now Progressive Field, and there was a small museum at the ballpark where our team shop is now, but that kind of went away. And you get the excitement of those 90s teams, and why wouldn't you want to focus on consistent World Series contender? Mm-hmm. The excitement was there, and there was attention elsewhere. So it makes sense not to focus on any sort of museum at that point. And you have sellout crowds. You're not looking to bring fans in because they're already there. So in the mid 2000s, then there was kind of like this perfect storm of finding the plaque, and we weren't in the midst of a 455 game sellout streak either. So you want to create these events that remind fans of the past and some of these guys, because it's that connection to our roots and our history. And we're just looking to renovate the stadium. There's always new things at our ballpark going on. And one of the things was our Heritage Park, and reinvigorating that Hall of Fame, because I got really spotty, because it was the 50s were pretty good, the 60s there's odds and ends, 70s I think Satchel gets into ours, and then it's just quiet. So then there's all these overlooked guys that you end up being able to bring back in, and I'd be surprised if there's any teams right now that don't have a team Hall of Fame. I know the Astros just opened one, and why not have one too? Right. That's the other question. I mean, it's like, it doesn't hurt anything, and our Hall of Fame's still around. It's still talked about.
And that kind of brings us back full circle to what your job is with the team. In your opinion, what are some of the best artifacts in the team's possession today? You mentioned the Larry Doby contract.
Right. In our Feller exhibit, we have a bat that Babe Ruth was leaning on for his Babe Bows Out photo. That was actually Bob's bat. Yeah. So I think that's the biggest, ticket item, so to speak. But when Jay Bruce had his walk-off double to win the 22nd game, we were able to get his jersey. The players kind of ripped it a little bit. And we have the last out ball from games 15 through 22. We have Tyler Naquin's jersey from his Inside the Park home run against Toronto, which, again, it's in baseball history, it's just another day. But in Cleveland history, that's one of those games where fans will remember where they were. And, that's such an iconic moment of that season that it's great to have these artifacts to save. So those are some of my favorites. And then just, we have Shane Bieber's BP jersey from the 2019 All-Star Game. We have bases from that and balls. And those are some of my favorites. We're trying to build up some of the stuff we've missed because, again, there wasn't anyone in my position for the longest time. Mm-hmm. So we don't have a lot from, a lot of our history, which you have the nicest museum in the world, but if you don't have anything to populate it with, it's kind of a bittersweet, but
What is a piece that people are normally surprised to see when they check stuff out, either because it's so cool or because it's just so obscure?
That's a good question. We had a jar of dirt from the Braves field from 1948 mailed to us. I've never really put that on display, but
That's cool.
They sent that as like a good luck thing and during 2016.
If you could wake up tomorrow and have 3 pieces just like magically appear on your desk from Cleveland history, what would you hope that those 3 pieces would be?
A 1916 jersey with the
numbers.
number on it.
Yeah. Talk about that a little bit. Why does that matter?
We were the first major league team to wear uniform numbers in 1916. They're on the sleeves and they kind of correspond to the lineup. It kind of fizzled out very soon thereafter. And then in the 20s, we were the first team to wear them on our back, too. Yankees often get credited, but they were rained out, so we were the first team to actually wear them.
The same thing happened when the American League started. Every game other than the Cleveland and Chicago White Sox game was rained out. So, yeah, you've got
a lot of firsts in Cleveland history that I think get overlooked. But, yeah, so definitely one of those unis. There's pictures you can see with those uniforms that are really cool. And we had Ebbets Field Flannels reconstruct one for us. I'd also love a 1921 World's Champion uniform just because those are so like bizarrely cool.
Yes.
So I would love one of those. And then for a third thing, there's a story about Ray Caldwell being struck by lightning in 1919. 1 out left in the 9th, and he gets struck by lightning, which knocks him on his butt and knocks Chapman and a few other guys. So you think of Chapman's bad luck. He was struck by lightning, and then the next year got hit in the head and died. So I guess maybe having like the ball from that game, the last out ball, and it's one of those quirky stories that fans, when they hear about it, it's like, wait a second, what? This guy got struck by lightning and was able to get up, finish the game, and then it downpoured. So every August we get inquiries about that, but maybe a ball from that game.
Yeah, that's cool. How can people reach out to you and keep up with you and things that you're doing these days?
My Twitter account is usually the best way. I'm at Feador, Jfeador. That's right. Kind of just stick to baseball on that. I field questions through there, or comments, or if you just go through our fan services, if it's something a little bit more detailed, that will get to me too.
Cool. And you say you do a little bit of the Cleveland Guardians social media as well. How do people follow you guys now?
If you were already following us at Indians, it just rolled over, so you're still following us at the CLE Guardians. So no need to click anything. You're still following us.
Awesome.
And Cleveland's Team, a baseball history podcast. I have a few lined up. I've already spoken with people. So
the podcast used to be called Our Tribe History.
Right.
Have you guys figured out what the team is kind of like going to be colloquially called? Because is it going to be like the Guards? Like what are...
I think it's one of those things that's just best left to being organic, and maybe we'll see. I don't know. That's a good question. It's going to be a fun year just to get back out there and see what pops up. Because, I think you don't want to force anything either. So
yeah. Thank you so much for your time. This was awesome. I hope it sheds a little light on the rich history of this franchise and baseball in Cleveland in general. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Love talking about Cleveland. Big fan of the city. If you haven't been here, check it out. Come see Shoeless Joe's plaque at our Team Hall of Fame, or Chapman's plaque, or get out to Lakeview Cemetery or League Park, or there's a lot to see. Much like any other baseball city, I just think Cleveland's probably the best of them all. So that's my opinion. No bias there.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.
And now it's time for a segment called What'd You Think, Mom?, where we talk to my mom who just listened to the interview with me, and we ask her what she thinks. This is my real, actual mom. Her name is Lori, but I've always just called her Mom. Can you say something to prove that you are my mom?
One of the best parts of being your mom was watching you play baseball as a little kid. And the first season that you played true Little League, not T-ball or something like that, was in 1994, and you played for the Indians. Mm-hmm. It was great to watch you grow into the sport, and we watched for many years. I still love watching baseball at that level. Mm-hmm. A bonus of that season was getting to meet and then know over the years a great kid named Matt Corning, a dear friend. But there we go.
Yeah. That was before anybody taught me how to properly bend or curve a hat. I don't know who...
Here comes the disclaimer.
I don't know who did that for me. There's no way I would have done that. Right?
What, you think like somebody else was shaping your hat?
What would have made me do that?
Seeing other kids do it, or being around baseball. You had already played and been on the field, and mm-hmm. even if you see older kids or whatever, and it might have been your interpretation of what they were doing.
Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, I knew you were going to like Jeremy from the moment he talked about being into cemeteries.
Right. When Jeremy was talking about the steps in the process of what he was doing for his research project, it reminded me immediately of what the Sabre Landmarks Committee is doing. Their research is generating this amazing baseball graves map that is taking the research, finding these different cemeteries all over the country that could be small, can be large, where baseball players are buried. And somebody who could live in that community and might visit a loved one in that cemetery has no idea of who's buried there. But also for baseball fans when you're on the road. And they're integrating the research onto the website of the cemetery or a website called Find a Grave. Or when you go into the graves map, you can see the fruit of the research that they're doing.
Yeah, on the same road trip driving from South Carolina to Cleveland to record this interview with Jeremy, on the way there, I stopped in Newcomerstown, Ohio, to go to the Cy Young Museum, and he is buried in that town also. So I went to his grave, and that was a really cool...
Yeah.
It was technically a cemetery because other people were buried there, but it wasn't like a gated thing. It was just almost like it was in somebody's backyard. Mm-hmm. I'm sure it just started as a family cemetery, and then people in the surrounding areas were like, can we bury our person there too?
Yeah.
But a beautiful location overlooking a hill, and he's got a cool marker with a baseball with wings. So
Cool.
yeah, I'll throw up some pictures on the liner notes of that. But Newcomerstown is like just a small town in rural Ohio that,
Right.
it's just where he was from.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and you can be going past there, and it's like, okay, where am I? And it's like, oh yeah, you're right by Cy Young, and
right.
But it doesn't even have to be someone that famous. The stories of some amazing baseball players in the Negro Leagues and in Major League Baseball as well, and they're just there. And the beauty of this research that Sabre does is you can find out, here lies this guy who was just phenomenal. He was a pitcher who, along the lines of Satchel Paige or whatever, and the stats are, you're going, holy cow. How did I not know about this guy? And you didn't know because the research just wasn't available. Things weren't digitized the way they are now. But the Negro Leagues especially, it's hard to find things because you didn't have the coverage. Like Jeremy referred to that when he was talking about the Cleveland Plain Dealer did not cover the Buckeyes. So that's a problem for researchers because you don't always have box scores to compute actually what were the records. But you can look at a photo now and see this person in his prime, often in uniform,
We're going back to the Paul Referson episode when he talked about trying to research Javan Emery. And when he first started doing that research, nothing was digitized yet. Nothing was online. So he had to go to physical New York Public Library or
Right.
here and there and here and there. And then he couldn't make the progress he wanted to make, so he just put it on the back burner and then came back later and was like, okay, now that so much has been digitized, can I find more information? And luckily, yes, now he can. So like Jeremy talked about wanting to get the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the Cleveland Press digitized and maybe start a GoFundMe or do some sort of
the
project.
press.
But I mean, all those newspapers, eventually all that stuff's going to get lost.
Right.
So if there's somebody who can get it online and preserve it, that's what this is all for. So yeah, I'm all for trying to preserve that stuff.
Yeah.
One of the people that we talked about in this interview was Charlie Summers, who was a major, major figure in baseball history, and almost no one knows his name. At one point, he was part owner of 4 of the 8 teams in the American League: Cleveland, Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia. The American League just wouldn't have gotten off the ground without him, without his enthusiasm for the sport, and most importantly, his money. He's buried in Lakeview Cemetery, which is also where Ray Chapman's buried. But that is an enormous cemetery. It's a very famous one nationally, but definitely in Cleveland as well. The 20th president of the United States, James Garfield, is buried there, but so is John D. Rockefeller, Elliot Ness, members of President Lincoln's cabinet, Civil War generals and Revolutionary War soldiers, and not to mention 22 former Cleveland mayors, including Carl B. Stokes, who was one of the first black elected mayors of any major U.S. city. On my trip to Cleveland to record this interview with Jeremy, I met journalist Vince Guerreri at the cemetery, and Vince is Cleveland through and through. He wrote a great book called Weird Moments in Cleveland Sports, Bottlegate, Bedbugs, and Burying the Pennant. So check that out if you have a chance. But let's talk about Jeremy and his love of cemeteries a little bit first.
Before you said a word, I was going to say he did a big cemetery project. He talked about what was involved in that project, and you research headstones, and he ends up having a map of that cemetery that he was working with in his head because you're so focused on it. The thing about cemeteries is it is history. Maybe not living history, but that is what a historian does. It makes it living history. And when you're able to do that successfully by telling the stories of someone who's buried there, and it doesn't have to be someone who has the caliber of reputation already of the people you just named at Lakeview. It could be anybody. There's a story behind every stone, and you pull out those stories and make those people real. And there's lots of ways to do that. You can go into U.S. Census reports, and you can actually see the page where that person is alive. You're seeing it in the handwriting of the census taker, and you can see what day in 1910 or 20 or 1900 or 1770 or whenever the first census was, which was very early in our country's history. Those original records are now digitized for all to see, and you can get a lot of cool information. And every 10 years, there's a census, obviously. And I often think what's happening today, where we're losing some of the cool things that were in prior decades' censuses, because they changed every 10 years because different factors of information were things that Congress needed to know to do their job. And so they would ask about where your mother was born, did they speak English, how many years of school you had, whatever. You can get a lot out of that, and you can make the people be real. And it's no surprise to me that once they did that with the cemetery that Jeremy did for his project, that vandalism starts to go down, because now it's not just an overgrown hole in the wall, like a dead spot in the landscape. Now it is the home of somebody who you can relate to.
Yeah. I think talking about Ray Chapman, to me, one of the real tragedies about Ray Chapman is that he had indicated that the 1920 season was going to be his last season. Jeremy kind of touched on this a little bit, but shortly before the season began, Chapman married Kathleen Daly, who was the daughter of a prominent Cleveland businessman, and Chapman had said he was going to retire to devote himself to the family business into which he was marrying, as well as to begin a family. So as if that story wasn't already sad enough, Jeremy also brought up the fact that if Charlie Summers had chosen to build around Joe Jackson instead of Ray Chapman, then Ray Chapman doesn't die either. Joe Jackson ends up in the Hall of Fame probably.
Right.
Here's another thing to add on top of that like, oh man,
yeah,
how differently things could have turned out. There are so many different points where you could choose path A or path B, and the wrong path got chosen every time.
Right. The fate of that decision is amazing to think about. Looking at the Ray Chapman situation, one of the first baseball books that I just could not put down, and I had to go down the rabbit hole, as Jeremy said, because that's what you do, was The Pitch That Killed, which covers the story of Ray Chapman and the season of the 1920 Cleveland Indians. That's where I first got to know Jack Graney and, of course, Tris Speaker. But there's the human side of what was going on with the team, and it also really covered how beloved Ray Chapman was in the city. I know Jeremy referred to that, but it was huge. It was huge when he was killed, and the city was just in wall-to-wall grief. You had the young widow, you had the pregnant young widow, and you had him struck down in his prime, and his personality was so endearing to fans and opposing teams, and he was just that guy. So when you see the memorial that funds were collected for, that happened right away. And the floral arrangements, the photographs in the newspapers from that time, you feel what was going on. And you can tell if you are a historian, for example, and you've seen newspaper articles from all over the place and from all different points in time, these stand out. It is something.
Well, if you think about today, like if you're in college and your roommate dies, they just give you straight A's for the semester. This happened to the emotional leader of a baseball team in a pennant race, and their record took a hit for a couple weeks, but then they pulled it back together and went on and won the World Series. Like, imagine the mental strength of the teammates on his team.
That's it.
To overcome that tragedy.
That's it. And if you are a baseball fan, you have to read that book if you haven't already, because Tris Speaker leads that charge.
Right.
And he was best friends with Ray. And he still is able to overcome his drop to his knees grief to pull himself out and say, we need to do this. And they do.
Talking about Jack Graney, we recorded this interview before he had actually won the 2022 Ford Frick Award. But spoiler alert, he does win the 2022 Ford Frick Award. which is presented annually for excellence in baseball broadcasting by the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. So just another cool bookend to that part of the conversation. We mentioned he was the first player to become a broadcaster after his career. So pretty cool that Cleveland has so many of these firsts in baseball history. First,
really, yeah.
Whether it was color line stuff or whatever the case may be. They really are a progressive organization.
Right. And he was a great character. I came to know him through the book at first, but then at the Shoeless Joe Museum, there is this great panoramic view from the Addie Joss benefit. And there are so many levels to analyze this photograph, which goes back to conversations with Paul Referson. They captured this moment in time, but it is like a who's who. And the photograph that is in the museum has the players' names underneath, which is so helpful. In terms of the museum, when I would give a tour, it would be, look at who Joe is facing, who's on the pitching mound when he's at bat, and when he's earning these batting titles, or close to the batting titles, because, of course, Ty Cobb. Mm-hmm. But Walter Johnson and Cy Young. And there were like 5 Hall of Fame pitchers. I don't remember all of them right now. Mm-hmm. But that was informative. You know, it put things in perspective. And it's like you have to look at the context of the era in which they're playing. Mm-hmm. And that was one way to do it. Look at who the contemporaries are, or that are on the field at the same time as them. But then there was also the playfulness. I don't know if you've ever had a panoramic shot like that where you have a big group. It takes forever. Even when I was in high school and they did one, you know, it took forever. So that Jack Graney is standing with his teammates in the first start of it. But as you slide your eyes over to the other side of the photograph, which is very long, there's Jack Graney again, because he runs over to play that joke, and that tells you who Jack Graney is. Mm-hmm. And then with the dog, there's a book, Jack and Larry. So he just was a character, and again, a lovable guy, and, you know, talent, but didn't take himself too seriously.
Yeah. Speaking of another person who was beloved in Cleveland, Bob Feller. When Jeremy mentioned that he drove the items from the Bob Feller Museum back to Cleveland when it closed, I went on an Iowa road trip in August of 2022 with my friends Neil, Sarah, and Nevin, and we went to what is left of the Bob Feller Museum in Van Meter. It used to be its own standalone building, but now it's just a couple rooms in the Van Meter City Hall. And it was cool to see what they still had, but talking to Jeremy really made me wish that I'd gotten there to see what that place was like in its heyday. And that was a fun trip. We saw a couple Frank Lloyd Wright buildings in Iowa, a couple Louis Sullivan buildings, the Surf Ballroom, which was the venue where Buddy Holly played his last concert before the day the music died. We drove out to the crash site of their plane. We saw the house which Grant Wood used as inspiration for American Gothic. But on that same road trip, we also found the barn next to the house where Bob Feller grew up. And the story goes that it was in that barn where Bob Feller learned how to pitch. So that was cool to see, too.
Right. Again, being in the space is so important. I have road trip envy right now. I did when you went, and I still do. It was interesting to hear the conversation of how the Indians became the Guardians. And when you look at photos of the Guardians on the bridge, they are so powerful. Mm-hmm. It's easy to see why they would be such a source of pride, because you look at that and it's power and pride. Mm-hmm. I love the name now.
And the fact that it's right by the stadium.
Yeah. And if fans are walking across the bridge to get to the games, it's great.
Right. You know, it used to just be something cool that you walk past, and now it's like, okay, we're walking past the Guardians. Like, we're on the way to the game. Like, if it already wasn't a symbol of baseball's about to happen, like, now it definitely is.
Right. And you stand taller, because that's the feeling that is generated by those statues. Art Deco style, great style to them. They're just wonderful.
That's my favorite type of architecture.
Yeah.
There's a couple threads that happen on Twitter every few months where, like, the beginning of the thread is America could have been the Art Deco country in this world. Mm-hmm. And it shows all of these buildings that were built in the 1920s and 30s. Right. That's like main buildings in Chicago, main buildings in New York, main buildings in Cleveland. Some of them are still standing. And it's like, man, that is just such a powerful, like, distinct, unique look that I don't know why they tore those things down and replaced them with concrete buildings in the 60s and 70s that were just square. Who thought that that was a better idea?
It's insane. And it's such a tragedy, though it would sometimes take a lot of money to get them. You know, they were so old by standards at that point, and they might not have been their capacity, especially in the heart of cities, like in the Loop, for example. Mm-hmm. But when they started doing that, there was a guy in Chicago, and he knew what was happening. He could see it unfold before his eyes. So he went and he started photographing and trying to capture everything in the details, let's say, of the Carson Peary Scott building right on State. get the doors, get the hinges, get the sconces within, all these different architectural details that were beyond.
Going to be lost.
Yeah. And he would go in and he tried to take them out, and whatever. And he ended up dying in one of those buildings because he fell to his death kind of thing. But when you look at his photographs, you realize what a loss that was.
There's a guy named Bob Busser who does that with stadiums in America. He's been to hundreds of baseball stadiums, basketball stadiums, like the Chicago Amphitheater and all these places that most of them now have since been torn down, but he's been there over the past few decades photographing. So he's been to League Park before, like, it was in disarray and not a safe structure anymore that was being used.
Yeah.
So he knew, like, okay, this place is getting torn down.
Right.
I need to go photograph what's left of it. So he's literally any venue you can think of in the past 50 years. Like, Bob has been there and taken pictures of it, and it's incredible. I'll throw some pictures on the liner notes with a link to his website, but it's incredible. And that brings me to thinking more about the Cleveland Baseball Hall of Fame that is lost to the sands of time because nobody really thought to document it. That used to be in Cleveland's Municipal Stadium in the ballpark. And Jacob Pomrenke wrote an article about the Cleveland Baseball Hall of Fame that was originally published in the Sabre Black Sox Scandal Research Committee's December 2016 newsletter, but lives on his own website now. I'll throw a link to that article in the liner notes as well. But it's a crime that each of the 8 original National League and each of the 8 original American League teams don't have a proper museum to tell the history of their franchises,
right?
To honor the best players, to display artifacts. Like, it's such an easy thing to do. And people will say, oh, well, if they could make money off of it, they would. Well, the Cincinnati Reds have proven that you can do that.
Right.
They have a standalone museum. It's somewhat connected to the stadium, but they charge admission. And a few years ago, they did like a $7 million renovation to it, funded by admission tickets from the past few years.
Right.
So, like, there is money. Anybody who's traveling from around the country, because that is the thing that people do, is they want to go to every ballpark.
Exactly.
So forget about your own fan base. If I go to a different city because I want to go see their baseball stadium, and you tell me that for an extra $12 I can go to a museum at the stadium,
right?
Who's not going to do that?
Right.
I'm paying $1,000 for this vacation.
Exactly. You're the target audience.
So the fact that every team with a history like this doesn't have a museum, and it doesn't need to be a standalone building, it can be just a display in the stadium. Instead of having 3 different gift shops,
right,
make one of them a museum.
Right.
And that's a place where you can honor people like Elmer Flick. We don't have a number to retire, so this is where you can honor somebody like that and show a photo and have a caption that's like, this guy was an incredible base stealer for 10 years in our franchise's early year. Like, that's a great place to do things like that. And the fact that the original 16 teams, not all of them have that, I'll never understand.
I think I know some things about baseball and baseball history. And when you were going through the timeline of the different name changes and you came up to the era of the Spiders, and you said their best player was, Cy Young. I didn't know that.
Right.
I didn't know that. And
right.
Of course, I know Cy Young. I know who he was and why we still talk about him. But I wouldn't have been able to tell you that he played for the Cleveland Spiders.
Right. Yeah, most people
and
associate Cy Young with the Boston Red Sox. And yeah, that's where he played a good chunk of his career, and that's the first like true major league team that he's associated with. But he pitched long enough to have almost 800 complete games. Like,
right.
He pitched other places than Boston. And, he finished his career with Cleveland, but he started his career kind of with Cleveland too. So, yeah, I think those types of spaces would be beneficial. And another thing that teams don't think about is you're trying to create fans for the long term. You're not just trying to sucker somebody into paying $500 to bring their family of 4 to one game, and then that's the only experience they have because they realize it's not affordable.
Right.
And not every person, regardless of their sex, not every person cares about the sport and watching the game happen. But if you can draw them in through the history,
right.
Like, if I turn on a baseball game today for the first time in my life, I don't think I would become a fan. I don't know. There's just so many other entertainment options that are faster and cheaper and more exciting. And when you think about the politics that are involved, like, there are so many reasons not to be a fan of baseball. But when you draw in people with, here's something that happened in 1880.
Yeah.
Or here's the history of your favorite franchise, and they did something incredible in 1920 and then signed the first black player, and then the next year won another championship. And
right.
You can tell the story of, like, your team hasn't won a World Series since 1948. Well, this is why the city still roots for this team. Instead of giving up and just being like, oh, I'll just be a Pirates fan. They're close enough.
Yeah.
Not that they'd be a better team to root for, but there's this sense of community and anguish that a city feels
Right.
rooting for a team that doesn't win and hasn't won.
Right.
And yet you still root for them. And it's because of the history. It's because of the link to past generations that your father was a fan of the team. Your grandfather was a fan of the team. So for the teams themselves to not understand that and embrace it and do what they have to do to monetize it, because that's what they want to do. At the end of the game, it's about money for them. So figure out a way to monetize it. It can be done.
Right.
And it wouldn't take that much. You've got owners who are billionaires. It doesn't take a ton of money to acquire artifacts if they don't already have them in a team's archives, or crowdsource. You know, if a place like the Michael Jordan Museum opened tomorrow and they were looking for artifacts, I would seriously consider donating some of my things to know that like they're going to be on display for the world and they can be used. Like Mickey Mantle's boyhood home in Commerce, Oklahoma. That just went up for sale. They sold shares of it for $7 each.
Oh, okay. I'm going, really?
And there have been plans and attempts to turn it into a museum in the past, and it just never worked out. But like, if somebody with a vision came through and was like, hey, get me Billy Crystal's phone number, you know?
Right.
Get me anybody who's that age.
Right.
Mickey Mantle was their favorite player, and they either have stories or autographs or artifacts, or you don't think they would give them one piece to be like, oh yeah, we will create the Mickey Mantle Museum.
Right.
So again, I don't think it would be as hard as people think to create a museum like this in a place that has space to be used. I'm glad that Cleveland does this kind of thing and has spaces for that, but the fact that the White Sox don't infuriates me.
Right.
They're a charter member of the American League.
Yeah, and while we're talking about the White Sox for 1 minute, I just want to say thank you to Charlie Summers for funding Comiskey Park when it was first built back in the day, and it was absolutely beautiful.
Yes, the baseball palace of the world, beautiful.
That's it. Again, we were lucky enough to have a colorized version of the stadium when it was first built, and it is gorgeous with gardens hanging down on the exterior and the brick and just everything about it. It's stunning. So the vision that he had, and it is vision because he's putting up lots of money for different cities. You know, you can't just do it in two. You know, you need a league. And he was with it to the point of getting himself drained of his funds. He makes the sacrifices. So just want to say that place was gorgeous. Thanks, Charlie.
Yeah. And like I said at the beginning of this segment, it's a shame that more people don't know his name. You know,
Never heard of him.
The further away we get from those years, most people never heard of Ban Johnson. You know, Ban Johnson's Western League turned into the American League. We wouldn't have a World Series without that guy.
Right.
That's why I think podcasts like this are important and museums are important, because they can tell the history to people who are interested. 15 years ago, I don't think I'd necessarily heard the name Ban Johnson. I might have read it in a book, but I never did further research about him. Well, 15 years ago, who was more into baseball and baseball history than I was? You know, if I'm the person who is the target audience and I don't even know the stories, then what chance does a normal, just an average fan have?
I think you were right. Just a normal fan. But that's the beauty of the time we live in right now, is that things that weren't available in terms of resources, and they are available now. And so now you can find the stories. And that's critical when you do have a museum or something like this, where you have the social media to put the story out and, you know, draw people in. Because when you look at SABR, how many members are in SABR? The people are out there.
Right. Or authors like Rick Hune, who wrote about the Chalmers race.
Yeah.
That story would have been lost to the sands of time. Nobody would ever have known that again. That season had major implications.
Oh, yeah.
In baseball history.
Yeah.
From Ty Cobb winning the batting title, which goes on his record, to the number of career hits he had. And I think this is when people started doing the research, is when Pete Rose was approaching Ty Cobb's hit record.
Right.
They're like, okay, well, what number does he really need to break the record? And they realize, oh, the number we've been told all these years is wrong. And the commissioner was like, it's been in the record book long enough. Just keep it that way. Like, no.
Right.
That's
Right.
We know that that's incorrect.
Right.
So change it. I don't care how long we've been told that it's wrong. It's wrong.
Exactly. If you're so anal, and they are, about these different rules and records, let's tell the truth.
Or things like the Dutch Leonard affair, which we mentioned in the interview.
Speaking of the truth.
That happened in 1926, with 1925 being Dutch Leonard's last season. So imagine you're Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis. You think you've weathered the storm of the Black Sox scandal, and Babe Ruth has cemented the idea that baseball is fun and exciting, and it's the best way to spend an afternoon if you live in a city with a major league team. And now you get these letters between Dutch Leonard, Ty Cobb, and Tris Speaker confirming beyond a shadow of a doubt that these guys orchestrated the throwing of a baseball game during the 1919 season, which you've already investigated.
No.
You've thrown out the best team in baseball because they were throwing games during the 1919 season, and now 7 years later, you find out, oh, the best hitter who ever lived also did that. Mm-hmm. The best center fielder who ever lived at that time had done that. What do?
You sweep it under the rug?
You have to. And
I hate that guy. Hate him.
But what choice do you have? You know, if that story gets out.
Oh, you know, he's saving the league.
The sport is done.
The sport, yeah.
The sport is done because nobody can trust the legitimacy of it. Mm-hmm. And that was the reason why they kicked out the Black Sox in the first place, was that if nobody can believe that the games are being played on the level, people are going to stop paying their money to come watch these games.
Right.
So I get what he did, but now you've got two of the best players in the history of baseball retiring prematurely and abruptly, and nobody knows why. And it's like, oh, well, this is why.
Yeah.
So if you've ever wondered why Ty Cobb ended his career with the Philadelphia Athletics and Tris Speaker ended his career with a team that he shouldn't have either, that's why. Because they were forced to retire, and then the story kind of blew over and everybody forgot about it, and then they came back and
finished
ended
up.
Yeah, but what a crazy turn of events and set of circumstances.
Yeah.
And the gumption of Dutch Leonard to keep these letters, knowing that maybe one day I'm going to need to use these as blackmail.
Foresight might be the word you're looking for.
Maybe.
Yeah.
How strange for the great Ty Cobb to have been taken down by a guy that he just didn't want on the team anymore. And Dutch Leonard was like, oh, you don't think I can play anymore? I don't think you can either.
Jeremy mentioned Brian Powers' work with Bandbox Ballparks.
Yes.
And while we were listening to the interview, when that came up, you shared some of Brian's work, and it was amazing. It was so worth the time to go to his Twitter account and take a video tour of some of these stadiums that no longer exist. It's not just looking at a silent screen. You have the music playing. You have the sounds of the ballpark. Every angle, even when you're going along a street level view to get to a ticket counter or whatever, and you can still see the field through the walkways up on the upper level, it was just so cool. And I hope he does Shibe Park at one point, because that is going to be a gorgeous thing. I know
He's
so
at the
time
mercy.
consuming.
Well, it's not only that, he's at the mercy of, do the original blueprints still exist in quantity enough to create the design and the architectural structure through his program. He has done the original Comiskey Park. He did League Park, and he's done Crosley Field in Cincinnati. The one he's working on now is Ebbets Field. But yeah, his plan is to just go through and get as many of these done while he's able.
Ironically, the one you chose to show me wasn't Comiskey, now that I think about it.
It
It was Crosley Field.
Yeah. That was just the first video I found. Yeah.
But when you hit the interior portion, when you're walking along the concourse inside, I said right away, it's the feel of Comiskey. I remember being in Comiskey, and that was like, it was it. It just felt the same way.
Well, that's what I was going to say about Brian's work, is that for me, was I technically in Comiskey Park? Yes, but I was a baby. I don't remember it. So it's cool for me to go back and see those videos, because it's like, oh, this is what a stadium you've never really truly experienced was like. You know, I was never in League Park.
Right.
I was never at Crosley. I certainly have never been in Ebbets Field. But imagine how emotional that must be for somebody who was at those games.
Right.
And somebody who grew up and hasn't seen those stadiums in 70 years. To watch Brian's video and be like, this is exactly what it felt like to walk through the concourse when I went to go see Jackie Robinson play.
Yeah.
How powerful must that be?
And the way he uses the images of the key players, or it just puts you in that space.
Well, he's not just doing that on his own free will. Like, he looks at period appropriate photographs and is decorating the stadium as it was decorated.
Okay.
And trying to find like an original version of a photograph that he sees displayed. Like, he will try and find it and then put it there. Like in Comiskey Park, they've got the Bard's room. And so he has that decorated with jerseys on the wall and photos and the mantle, the fireplace. Like, he didn't just come up with that willy-nilly. Like, he studied photos of the Bard's room and then put them up where they went.
I'm just thinking, like, on the concourse, it just looked like it was a panorama of different players.
A cornucopia, you mean?
Oh, yeah, let's go with that. Wow. Bonus word.
When I talked in the interview about the Hots Cafe, I knew so much about that place because I went there in August of 2017 with that same friend Neil on a road trip where we saw games in Cleveland, in Pittsburgh, and in Cincinnati. The Hots Cafe is located in the Tremont area just outside of downtown Cleveland. The bar opened in 1919 and has been in the Hots family for 4 generations. They don't have the signed checks from Babe Ruth or Ty Cobb or anyone else on display anymore. I'm pretty sure those are locked up in a safe deposit box somewhere, but it's one of those places like we always talk about on the show where it's just cool to be in the space and know that you're sitting where Babe Ruth sat, drinking where these guys came and partied, and who knows what debauchery happened. But like, if you didn't know that history, you'd never know walking in. It's a little dive bar.
Yeah.
And they don't make a big deal about it. Like, they've got some old baseball things, but it's not like, this is the place where this happened. It's just a bar. Mm-hmm. Those are the hidden gems in a city that link you to the past.
And it's great when they're still standing and if these walls could speak kind of thing. Mm-hmm. It also lets you know all these stories. They let you know that these names on plaques are not just guys that were old farts and their names are on a plaque. You know, he's talking about Nap Lajoie and how he was still under contract to Philadelphia when he decides to come play for Cleveland.
Right.
And now he can't enter the state of Pennsylvania. Did not know that about Nap.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a big deal because he was one of the best players in baseball when he left. It wasn't like he was a young kid starting his career. Like, he was established as a superstar already, and they stole him, you know? Yeah. So, yeah, if he would have entered the state, they were going to come get him. And he's just like, okay, well, I guess I'm not going to enter the state then.
Just imagine that. So, like, the team is traveling somewhere, and he's got to go take another train to bypass the state.
Yes. Another thing that Jeremy brought up was Joe Sewell, who was Ray Chapman's replacement at short after he passed away. Jeremy said he thought there was a season where he struck out 4 times. Jeremy was kind of close. From 1925 to 1933, he never struck out more than 9 times in a season.
Holy cow.
He had 2 seasons where he struck out 4 times, one where he struck out 3 times. He only played 109 games that season. 3 strikeouts in 109 games.
Unbelievable.
And it wasn't his best season in that 9-year stretch of strikeout to at-bat ratio. Like, this guy was a dynamo at the plate. He never struck out. Unbelievable.
Wow.
Yeah, just truly incredible. Another thing, we talked about it a little bit, but kind of glossed over, was the fact that Tris Speaker would turn unassisted double plays in center field.
Oh, man.
I don't think people realize how crazy that is. That, especially with an outfield wall that's 420, 425 feet away behind you, if a line drive or a fly ball gets past you, it's a home run.
Right.
And he's still like, I think I got this. Playing shallow enough that when he catches those line drives, he can just run in and step on second base before the runner on second who had taken off gets back.
Right.
That is guts.
Absolutely amazing.
And trusting your own talent and ability and knowing that, like, I'm going to be able to make this play. You know, he would make Willie Mays catches a lot too because he had to. He played so shallow that he would, any ball over his head, he's got to catch it over his shoulder like that.
Right.
That's how shallow Willie Mays would play sometimes too, is because he just trusted himself. He knew a ball over my head I'm going to be able to get to. So I might as well play shallow, and maybe I can keep a line drive. Maybe I can throw the guy out at first base. Yeah. When otherwise it's just a routine single and everybody just takes it for granted. But Tris Speaker and guys like that, there weren't a lot of people like them.
You have to have a level of confidence in yourself, and there you go. What does he become? The player manager. And what does he do in 1920? They end up winning the World Series because of him.
Yeah.
Okay, I do have to give a shout out for Lou Boudreau, because that's how we would say it, Lou Boudreau.
Yeah. When I say it that way to most people, they're like, you mean Lou Boudreau? And I'm like, that's who you mean.
Yeah.
But why do you pronounce it that way?
Because I'm from Harvey, Illinois.
Yes.
Born and raised. When he was playing in the 48 series, my parents were getting married October 2nd, 1948 in Harvey. And he would come back to Harvey. So there would be Lou Boudreau days in the 1960s and the 1970s. There'd be a big parade and the whole thing. And I lived there until 1979, you know, other than going away for school. But, he was a beloved son and just a regular guy. There was a wonderful steakhouse in Harvey, Illinois for decades. It was called Gino's Steakhouse. My mom worked there. He would come into Gino's all the time, and he was just that guy. So it's great to see, as a kid, I didn't understand more than we were going to parade for him. But now I know who he was and that he played for Cleveland and what he did, and that he was playing on an integrated team without any issue. That is his Harvey experience, because Harvey was integrated already when my parents were kids and going to high school and whatever. So that was it.
Yeah, it was no big deal to
No
him.
big deal.
Yeah.
Anyway, definitely the pride of Harvey. It was cool to talk about Bill Veeck after having the Mike Veeck interview and already coming to admire Bill Veeck in a different way, even though we're from Chicago. It was great to see it from this side, the success of his progressive stance of integrating Negro League players into Major League Baseball. He brings on Larry Doby as the first black player to play in the American League, 11 weeks behind Jackie Robinson. You have Satchel Paige as the first black player to pitch in a World Series, and they win that World Series. You have Larry Doby playing in that World Series, and then you have Frank Robinson coming in as a player manager.
And that was years later, so that wasn't under Bill Veeck anymore. But
No,
the fact that Bill Veeck set that tone,
Exactly.
that this is what we expect, and if the person is going to help us win, it doesn't matter what color they are. And that seems to be a sentiment that Cleveland kept with them after Bill Veeck had left.
Absolutely, and especially with Frank Robinson, the first black manager. That's really important. I mean, you look at how integrated sports are today at that level. And Veeck was laying the groundwork for that back in the 40s.
80 years ago, Bill Veeck was like, do you not see the talent? Who cares what color his skin is? The goal is to win, and this guy can help us win. You're crazy to not be seriously considering bringing them in.
Right.
I mentioned that when I was growing up, I thought I was going to be the shooting guard for the Chicago Bulls.
Yeah, I remember those years.
And I was serious. And it's one of the reasons why I never liked Tony Kukoc as much as I should have. Not because he was a shooting guard, because he wasn't. He played the 3. But because he wore number 7. And I was like, if his number gets retired, then I'm never going to be able to wear number 7 when I play for the Bulls. I've gotten over it, mostly.
Apparently, yeah.
But it's funny to think of, in these interviews, I almost always ask people, what did you think you wanted to do when you went to college? And the answer is never what I'm currently doing.
Right.
Never. I think that's an important thing to point out in these interviews, is that I'm talking to successful people and smart people, and none of them envisioned the life that they have.
Right. You just never know.
Yeah.
What's nice about Jeremy is he's doing something that has been his passion from a very young age.
Yeah.
That's great. For me, for example, as a kid, I loved history right away. The books I read were history. They were biographies and nonfiction. And it's still, today, that's what I like to read. But when I got to college, it was like, okay, will I be a history major? Then what? I also liked accounting, the logic. I was a math person. So I became an accountant. That was great. And then as soon as I was done with that, what have I done since then in several different aspects of my life? History things.
Right.
So
but even
you come
during,
back to your passion.
Even during your career, though, you would do art awareness.
Right. On the side, yeah.
You'd give tours at cemeteries in
Right.
Long Grove. And history has always been something that you come back to. And now that you're retired and have the time to go on trips and research and do family tree stuff, that's what you've been doing, because like you said, that's something that you've been interested in since you were a kid.
Right. You go back to your passion. And I've been lucky enough to do that. Jeremy's lucky enough to do it as a career. That's great. Follow your passion, and that's where your joy will come from.
Yeah. And Jeremy's a good example of that. So thanks very much, Jeremy. Appreciate the time and showing me around Progressive Field. After the interview was over, I'm packing up my equipment, and we recorded this the day before Thanksgiving. And so I was thrilled that he gave me as much time as he did. The fact that he was willing to sit down at all that day, because I knew he needed to go help set up for Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Not that we were rushing during the interview, because we definitely weren't, but I felt like I wanted to get him out of there.
Sure.
I knew how much I prepared. I know how long these interviews can be sometimes. So before we even started, I was like, how much time do you feel like you can give me? And he's just like, don't worry about it. Let's go. I was like, cool. Okay. So we talked for almost 3 hours. That's not how long the interview ended up being, but we talked for a good amount of time. And the whole time I'm looking at my watch man, I'm keeping him long. I feel bad. So as soon as we stop recording, I immediately start packing up my stuff, and I'm like, thank you so much. And he's like, you want to go walk around the field? And I was like, yes. And so we went on the field, and he took me around Heritage Park to see all the plaques and to see the statues, the Frank Robinson statue that's in the middle of it, and the Ray Chapman plaque that we talk about. So all the photos in the liner notes of anything associated with that are photos that I took on this day.
Yeah.
So thanks to Jeremy for that. That was a really cool experience. You know, every fan who goes to a game in Cleveland has the ability to see those things, but not the way that I saw them that day with Jeremy.
Yeah.
That was cool. So thank you again to Jeremy. And thank you, Mom.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, so that's it. In the introduction of this episode, I mentioned how there are a handful of ways for you to follow the podcast online. In addition to liking, subscribing, and giving My Baseball History a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app, please make sure you're also following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we are at Shoeless Podcast on each platform. By following us there, you'll get some bonus content throughout the month, and you'll be able to interact with us to let us know what you think of the show. You can also sign up for Clearing the Bases, our email newsletter, by heading to shoelesspodcast.substack.com. We publish 2 newsletters a month, which allow us to talk about lots of things we don't normally talk about on the show. I'll use that space to talk about the podcast, of course, but I'll also use it to write about baseball road trips I go on, to publish research I do, and to speak on current events in baseball, all of which are things I don't really do in episodes of My Baseball History. Look for a new issue to be published on the 2nd Friday and the 4th Friday of every month. If you have any questions about the podcast or research you'd like to contribute to a future newsletter, submit something through the contact form on our website or email us at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com. If you have ideas for guests you'd like us to talk to on the podcast, send us your list. If you know current or former baseball players, managers, broadcasters, or journalists who you can help get us in touch with, or if you are one, let's talk. Before the interview with Jeremy started, I said there was going to be a contest to give away a couple books we mentioned in the episode. The first is Luke Eplin's wonderful book, Our Team, the epic story of 4 men and the World Series that changed baseball. Luke's book is the riveting story of Larry Doby, Bill Veeck, Bob Feller, and Satchel Paige, whose improbable union on the Cleveland Indians in the 1940s would shape the immediate post-war era of Major League Baseball and beyond. With over 1,200 ratings on Goodreads.com, Our Team has a score of 4.48 out of 5 stars. For reference, To Kill a Mockingbird has 4.26 stars. The Chronicles of Narnia has 4.27. And The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein, one of the most beloved books of all time, has 4.38. To say that Luke's book is great is an understatement. The second book we'll be giving away is Vince Guerrieri's Weird Moments in Cleveland Sports, Bottlegate, Bedbugs, and Burying the Pennant. While Vince's book talks about the weird, random, and odd occurrences which have happened across all Cleveland sports, there are definitely lots of wild baseball-related stories too. Like the testy Tribe manager who got into a fight during an exhibition game with the AAA farm team. The rookie pitcher shot in the leg while riding on the team bus wearing a cheerleader outfit and go-go boots. A victory owed to a timely swarm of insects. When the mascot fell off the outfield wall and into live action during a playoff game. And, of course, the infamous 10-cent beer night. We're very grateful to have both Luke and Vince signing for us to make this Cleveland giveaway extra special. And you can enter for your chance to win by following @ShoelessPodcast on Twitter and retweeting the pinned tweet at the top of our profile which mentions this episode with Jeremy. We'll pick 2 winners before the next episode goes live on Wednesday, June 12th, and each winner will get 1 book. All you have to do to be considered is follow us on Twitter and retweet that pinned tweet before June 12th. But feel free to tag a friend in the comments or write why you think you should win. I'm not saying it'll help your chances, but I'm not saying it'll help your chances. During my conversation with Jeremy, we talked a lot about League Park, which is where Cleveland's professional baseball teams mostly played their home games from 1891 through 1946. As a Shoeless Joe Jackson historian and researcher, I've been fascinated with League Park for years. It's a ballpark I wish I'd have had the chance to see in its heyday, but unfortunately I was born just a little too late. When I was running the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum in South Carolina, every year we would play in a vintage baseball game against the Ty Cobb Museum from Royston, Georgia. One year, the game would be in Greenville and the Peaches would come up to play us at Shoeless Joe Jackson Memorial Park. The next year, the game would be in Royston and we would go down and play them on a field right behind the Ty Cobb Museum. I always fantasized about playing those games in other historic locations, and naturally, the site of League Park was at the top of that list, since it's a field where both Joe Jackson and Ty Cobb actually played. As I mentioned earlier, when Joe played for Cleveland, he lived just a couple blocks away from League Park, a straight walk down Lexington Avenue. Joe's wife Katie would be at each Cleveland home game, always sitting in the same seat so Joe would know where to look when he wanted to find her in the crowd. No matter what the score was, during the 7th inning stretch, Katie would leave the game, walk the couple blocks down Lexington to go back home, and start cooking dinner so by the time the game was over, Joe would have a hot meal waiting for him when he walked in the door. Katie was an incredible partner to Joe, helping him run his dry cleaning business in Savannah, Georgia after his playing career was over, helping him run his barbecue restaurant and then his liquor store in Greenville, South Carolina after that, and often helping with business deals, contracts, and signing autographs on his behalf throughout his life since Joe didn't know how to read or write. While Joe and Katie's former house in Cleveland is no longer standing, the field at League Park still is. And to fulfill a lifelong dream to be able to play on that field, I rented it for the night of Friday, July 26th, from 6 o'clock to 10 o'clock p.m. That weekend, from Wednesday, July 24th through Sunday, July 28th, the 44th Annual National Sports Card Convention will be held at the IX Center in Cleveland. I'm going to be going to that convention, and I figured, what better opportunity to cross something cool off my bucket list than to rent the field that weekend and throw a vintage baseball game. The Baseball Heritage Museum operates out of the original League Park ticket office, which is still standing. Normally, they wouldn't be open on a Friday night, but I pulled some strings and called in a few favors, and Ricardo Rodriguez, who is the museum's director, is going to keep it open for anyone who wants to come during those hours on Friday, July 26th. We're going to charge $10 to get into the game, but everyone who pays will then get free admission to the Baseball Heritage Museum too. We'll be donating all proceeds to the museum to help with their mission to preserve and present the history of diversity in baseball by entertaining, educating, and enlightening the visiting public about the multicultural heritage of baseball and the values it represents. The game will be played with 1860-style rules, which means the players won't be wearing gloves. We'll use a lemon peel baseball, and we'll pitch underhanded. There are some other minor differences which make that style game different than the modern game, but as a spectator you will definitely still recognize it as baseball. But just know, this whole time when I've been saying baseball referring to the 1860 style, there's been a space between base and ball. It's baseball, not baseball. Our players for the games are mostly set, but we may still have an opening or two in case we need some backups or alternates if anyone's travel plans or injury status changes between now and the game. If you think you may be interested in playing, reach out and I'll see what I can do to keep you in the loop. If you won't be able to be in Cleveland that weekend but still want to make a donation toward the game and the Baseball Heritage Museum at League Park, you can go to shoelesspodcast.com and click the donate button in the upper right corner. That is a direct link to my PayPal profile where you can make a donation in any amount. Just write vintage baseball in the comments section so I can make sure it goes to the right place. If you don't have PayPal and want to send a donation through Venmo, Zelle, Cash App, or any other payment processor, shoot me an email at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com with the subject line donation, and I'll send you directions for whichever method you prefer. If you're a photographer who's either based out of Cleveland or is going to be at the National and you want to come to the game to take some photos, let me know and we can work something out. Additionally, if you or your business would like to sponsor the game to help offset the cost of renting the field and printing the shirts we'll be making for the players, let me know and I would be happy to discuss that too. It's going to be a great time for a great cause during a great week, and I hope to see you all there. Don't forget, it's a huge help when you guys rate and review the show on whatever platform you choose to listen. 5-star ratings help our podcast get shown on more people's suggested podcast pages, which means that more people will hear our show. It just takes a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us a lot. And, of course, liking us on social media, interacting with our posts, and sharing things with your friends is great too. No matter how you choose to support us, even if it's just by listening, we appreciate you being here. Until next time, I'm Dan Wallach, and this is My Baseball History.